They sold her on a Tuesday. No ceremony, no grief, just a ledger entry, a wax seal, and her father's steady hand signing her name beside a number that couldn't cover his gambling debts. Lysera Vale, former mate bond severed, wolf silent for 3 years, womb declared barren by 2 imperial physicians and 1 cruel husband, walked out of her family home carrying nothing but the clothes her stepmother had already decided to burn. And somewhere in the obsidian capital, the most feared alpha king alive looked at a list of noble daughters and felt nothing, until he reached a name everyone else had crossed out. Stay with me until the end, beloved. Drop your city below, because where you are watching from tonight is exactly where this story was always meant to find you. The morning they came for her, the frost had not yet broken. Lysera was splitting wood behind the servants' quarters of the Vale estate, not because it was her task, but because no one had assigned her tasks in 8 months, and stillness had become a thing she could no longer afford. The axe was too heavy for her grip. The handle had been built for a man twice her size, which meant her shoulders screamed with every swing, and her palms bled through the cheap linen wrappings she had wound around them at dawn. She split the log anyway. Then the next one. Then the one after that. There is a particular kind of survival that does not announce itself. It does not stand in doorways and demand to be witnessed. It simply wakes up earlier than the shame does, picks up the heaviest thing available, and keeps moving before the mind has a chance to remember everything it has lost. Lysera Vale had been practicing that kind of survival for 3 years. It had made her lean in a way that had nothing to do with beauty. It had carved something behind her eyes that people mistook for emptiness, but was actually just vigilance. The permanent, exhausting readiness of a creature that has been ambushed enough times to stop being surprised by pain. She heard the horses before she saw them. 3 animals, imperial bred by the sound of the hooves, that particular clip of animals trained to carry weight over stone roads rather than soft earth. She lowered the axe and turned around without rushing. Rushing suggested hope. She had learned to strip hope out of her movements years ago. The man who rode into the yard was not a soldier. He wore no weapon openly. His coat was black wool trimmed at the collar with silver thread, the kind of tailoring that cost more than the Vale estate's annual harvest. And he sat his horse with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to being stared at. He was perhaps 50, with a face like carved ironwood and eyes the color of deep river water. Not cold exactly, but measuring, always measuring. Behind him, 2 riders flanked the gate. "Lysera Vale," the man said. Not a question. "Depends on who's asking," she said. "It doesn't, actually." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, the wax seal unbroken, stamped with a crest. She recognized the way you recognize a predator. Not from personal experience, but from every story ever told to frighten children into obedience. The Shadow Crown. 3 interlocked circles of black above a wolf's open jaw. "My name is Aldrich Voss. I am the collector for His Imperial Majesty King Valor Dreadmore of the Shadow Dynasty. You have been selected for the Imperial Tribute Assembly." He paused, studying her face with something that was not quite pity and not quite curiosity. "Pack what you need. We leave within the hour." Lysera looked at the axe in her hand. She looked at the man on his expensive horse. Then she looked at the door of the main house, where she could already see the curtain move, her stepmother's hand pulling back the fabric, watching, waiting to see which way this fell. "Selected," Lysera repeated. "By whom?" "By His Majesty's criteria, which are not available for discussion. His Majesty has never seen me." "No," Aldrich Voss agreed. "He has not." She set the axe down against the woodpile. Her palms were still bleeding. She did not reach for the cloth wrapped around the handle of the tool she had just abandoned. "You're taking me as tribute to the king." "I am fulfilling a requisition order, yes. My former mate bond was formally dissolved. I carry no pack affiliation. I cannot shift. The physicians have declared me incapable of bearing children." She said each one of those facts the way she had learned to say them, flatly, without flinching, the way you lance a wound before infection can set in. By every measure the Empire uses to assess a woman's value in an imperial tribute assembly, I am the least suitable candidate within 3 days' ride of this estate. Aldrich Voss looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said quietly, is an extraordinarily accurate summary of what every noble house has already submitted in written objection to this requisition. Something moved through his expression that was too disciplined to call amusement, but carried its shape. His Majesty received 47 formal complaints before breakfast. He has not yet responded to any of them. The man folded his document and returned it to his coat. "Pack what you need, Miss Vale, or don't, but you are coming with us." She turned and walked into the servants' quarters without another word. There was not much to pack: 2 changes of clothes, both worn thin at the elbows, a small tin of salve for the sores on her hands that never fully healed, a broken comb her mother had left her, the teeth cracked on one side, which Lysera had kept not for sentiment, but because it still functioned and she refused to throw away things that still functioned. A single letter from a woman who had once been her friend, never answered because answers required hope, and hope was something she rationed like the last canteen of water in a drought. She did not take the letter. Her father appeared in the doorway while she was tying the neck of her satchel. Brennan Vale was a tall man who had once been a formidable one. 3 years of declining pack standing, mounting debts, and the particular slow erosion of a man who had mortgaged his legacy on his children's bloodlines and watched each bet go wrong, had reduced him to someone who looked like the outline of the person he used to be. Same structure, less substance. He watched her pack with an expression that was working very hard to contain something he didn't want her to see. "You understand what this means," he said. "That you sold me," Lysera said. "Yes. I submitted your name to the collector's registry 6 months ago. It was a formality. No one expected... You expected nothing would come of it because no one wants me." She pulled the satchel strap over her shoulder. "So submitting my name cost you nothing and gave you the chance to say you contributed to the Imperial Assembly, which means something in the noble ledgers, doesn't it? Even if the name is rejected." She looked at him. His face had gone a particular shade of gray. "Only I wasn't rejected, so now you have what you wanted, a contribution to the crown, and I have what I've always had." She moved toward the door, and he didn't step aside immediately, which meant they stood close enough that she could see the exact moment he decided not to reach for her arm. "Lysera, don't." Her voice did not shake. 3 years of practice. "Whatever you're about to say, it will be about you, and I'm done listening to things that are about you." She walked past him. Her stepmother was standing in the main hall. Marit Vale was a woman who had arranged her face into an expression of dignified concern the way other women arranged flowers. With an eye for how it appeared from the outside, careful attention to which element softened the overall effect. She held that expression now as Lysera crossed the hall toward the front door. "You'll want to be grateful," Marit said. "The king could give you a comfortable life if you conduct yourself properly." Lysera stopped with her hand on the door. There are moments when the accumulated weight of everything you have survived decides to speak. Not in anger. Anger burns too fast and leaves you empty. But in the cold, clear, absolutely certain language of a person who has cataloged every lie told to her and no longer has any use for the social machinery that kept her silent. "You told Davin I'd deceived him," Lysera said without turning around, "about the bonding sickness. You told him the healers said it was dormant wolf blood, not a true mate pull. You said I'd manufactured the symptoms." She felt Marit go still behind her. "I know because the healer's apprentice who served you for 11 years developed a conscience 2 winters ago and found me." She was very specific. Lysera opened the door. The cold air came in hard and clean. "I hope the debts get paid. I genuinely do. You can have the rest of my things. I left the axe by the woodpile." She walked out into the frost. Aldrich Voss was waiting where she'd left him. He looked at the satchel on her shoulder, that single, worn bag that was the sum total of what 8 years of being discarded had left her with, and his expression remained carefully neutral. "That's everything?" he asked. "That's everything," she confirmed. He nodded once. Then he dismounted and gestured to the second rider, who brought forward a horse she recognized immediately as Imperial stock, dark gray, built for endurance, with the Shadow Crown brand on its left flank. The animal regarded her with the particular intelligent watchfulness of a horse that had been trained around pack wolves and had learned to assess whether any given stranger was worth trusting. She reached up and let it smell her hand before she put her foot in the stirrup. "You ride," Aldrich observed. "My mother taught me." She swung up without assistance. The horse accepted her weight without protest. Before she died. They rode out of the Vale estate gate in the early morning cold, and Lysera did not look back. Not because it didn't hurt, because hurting while looking back was a luxury. It cost you the ability to see what was coming, and something was always coming. The road to the Obsidian capital took 11 days. Aldrich Voss turned out to be a man of very few words, which Lysera found deeply restful. He spoke when there was something to say. The road condition ahead, the timing of stops, the names of way station keepers, and maintained silence during the long hours between settlements with the ease of someone who had long ago made peace with his own company. She asked him nothing about what waited at the end of the road, and he offered nothing, and this became a kind of agreement between them. On the fourth night, they sheltered at a way station on the edge of the Thornwall territory, where the innkeeper's wife looked at Lysera's plain traveling clothes and Aldrich's imperial insignia with the particular expression of someone trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they expected. "Noble houses have been sending girls to the capital for 2 months," the woman said as she set bread on the table. She was speaking to Aldrich but watching Lysera. Lord Askenfeld sent his 3 eldest daughters. House Morthen sent their only legitimate heir. A pause. "I heard the king rejected all of them." "You heard correctly," Aldrich said. "They say he hasn't accepted a tribute since his wife passed." The woman's voice dropped half a register, not into scandal exactly, but into the vicinity of it. 7 years. 12, Aldrich corrected, without inflection. Silence at the table. "He must want something very particular," the woman said finally. Aldrich picked up his bread and did not respond. Later, in the cold of the room she'd been given, Lysera lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about a king who had spent 12 years rejecting women and then sent his collector for someone that every official document in the empire described as worthless. There was a logic to it she couldn't quite reach, like trying to read a word in a language she almost but didn't quite know. She thought about her wolf. That was what the physicians called it. Her wolf, as if it were a pet that had run away rather than a piece of herself that had gone silent. The first healer who examined her after Davin dissolved the bond had spoken to her the way you speak to someone recovering from surgery, carefully, with the practiced gentleness of someone managing expectations. The silence might be grief response, he had said. The bond dissolution was a traumatic rupture. Give it time. She had given it 3 years. The wolf remained silent. Not dead. She knew what dead felt like in the bone-deep, instinctive way that wolves knew such things, the way a body knows the difference between sleep and absence. Her wolf wasn't dead. It was buried, which was worse, in its way, because buried things were buried for a reason. You don't bury something unless it is dangerous. She had never allowed herself to follow that thought to its conclusion. They arrived at the capital on the 11th morning. Velmora's obsidian city had not been built to comfort the people who entered it. It had been built to remind them of their scale. The outer walls were black stone quarried from the Vale Mountains to the north. Not dark gray, not charcoal, but true black, the kind that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, so that even on a clear morning the walls seemed to exist in perpetual dusk. The great gates were wrought iron worked into the shapes of wolves mid-stride, each one life-size, each one perfectly rendered down to the tension in the haunches, the set of the jaw. They had been made by an artisan dead for 2 centuries, and they remained the most unsettling depiction of power Lysera had ever seen. Not threatening, precisely, but deeply, anatomically honest about what power actually looked like when it moved. Inside the gates, the city opened into something she had not expected. Life. Not the grim, martial sterility she'd imagined from the stories. Children in the lower market. Merchants arguing over fish prices with the passion of people conducting deeply important negotiations. Packless wolves and humans moving through the same spaces with the particular practiced ease of people who have learned to inhabit shared ground. The architecture was severe. The obsidian stone used in the walls carried through every major building, all angles and height, and deliberate absence of ornamentation. But against that austerity, the people themselves created texture, color. The ordinary, insistent noise of a city that did not stop being alive because its king was fearsome. Lysera watched it pass from the back of her horse and felt something she could not immediately name. Then she named it. Grief. Not for herself. For the version of herself that had been told, repeatedly and with great conviction, that a life without pack affiliation and a functioning wolf and a mate bond was barely a life at all. Because the city she was riding through was full of people who had presumably been told similar things and had built something from the rubble of those declarations anyway. She had no idea what to do with that information. She filed it in the part of her mind that held things she was not ready to examine. The palace was worse than the city. Worse in the sense of more height, more weight, more absolute commitment to the architectural language of permanence. It rose from the city's center like something that had always been there and always would be, the kind of structure that makes you feel geologically humble. Silver fire. She had assumed that phrase was metaphorical, a poet's embellishment, burned in channels along the outer walls. It was not metaphorical. The flames ran in carved grooves of obsidian, fed by some mechanism she couldn't identify, burning silver white and utterly steady despite the morning wind. Aldrich dismounted at the inner courtyard and handed off his horse to a groom with the automatic ease of a man who had done this 10,000 times. "The preliminary assessment is this afternoon," he said, helping her down from her horse with a formality that was not condescending but simply correct. The instinctive courtesy of a man who understood that dignity was not something you earned by circumstances. "You will be housed in the eastern wing with the other tribute candidates. You will be given clothes appropriate to the occasion." "And the assessment itself?" she asked. "Is conducted by His Majesty's court physician and his senior advisors." He paused. "It is thorough." She understood what thorough meant in this context. It meant they would document every deficiency. They would measure every absence. They would write it all down and present it to a king who was, by all accounts, the most accomplished alpha alive. And they would confirm what every other official measure of her had already confirmed, that she did not belong here, that she had never belonged anywhere. She straightened her spine and followed Aldrich through the palace doors. The eastern wing housed 7 other women. They were, collectively, everything Lysera was not. The daughters and nieces and carefully prepared representatives of houses that had spent generations cultivating exactly the qualities the empire valued in its female bloodlines. They ranged in age from perhaps 19 to 30, and they ranged in disposition from elaborately composed to barely concealed terror, but they shared a common quality that Lysera clocked immediately and filed. They had all been prepared for this. Tutored and groomed and coached in what to say and how to stand and which version of themselves to present. They had been aimed at this moment the way arrows are aimed at a target, with intention, with expectation, with the complete confidence of people who understood the rules of the game. They looked at Lysera with the frank appraisal of wolves assessing a stranger on territorial ground. A girl with copper-red hair and the bearing of someone who had been told since infancy that she was exceptional spoke first. "You arrived with Voss." Not a question, an accusation shaped like an observation. "Yes, Lysera said. "From which house?" "Vale." A pause in the room. The name registered in the way that names with no current political weight registered. A flicker of recognition, a rapid calculation of relevance, a dismissal. "I don't know the Vale bloodline," said another woman, older, with the careful diction of someone whose first language was power. "Not from the Northern Territories, are you? The Northern Vale branch lost pack standing under the old king's edict." "Different Vale," Lysera said. "Southern, lesser branch." She set her satchel on the narrow bed that had been assigned to her. She could tell which one, because it was the only one without a preliminary gift arrangement of court flowers, and began to remove her traveling coat. "You don't need to know it." "Then why are you here?" the copper-haired girl asked. Her tone had sharpened. She was not being cruel exactly. She was being precise, the way a person raised to understand that resources were finite and competition was real was always precise. The assembly criteria required documented wolf activation, viable reproductive history or blood assessment, and pack affiliation within 2 generations. You're carrying a single bag. You came from the servant road, not the noble approach. She paused. "None of us know what criteria you meet." Lysera looked at her. "Neither do I," she said. That silenced the room. She turned back to her preparations with the focused practicality of someone who understood that the only useful response to a question without an answer was to keep moving until the answer arrived on its own. The preliminary assessment took place in a hall of white stone that existed in bizarre contrast to every other surface in the palace. Almost shockingly pale, almost aggressively neutral, as if whoever had designed it had deliberately intended it to feel like the absence of everything the rest of the building declared. A long table, 5 people seated behind it, the court physician, 2 advisors she didn't recognize, a woman in gray who moved with the unhurried authority of someone accustomed to watching and saying nothing, and at the far end, a man whose name she would have known even if she hadn't spent 11 days thinking about this moment. Vaelor Dreadmore was not what the stories built. The stories built a figure of deliberate menace, constructed mythology, the kind of reputation that accumulates around rulers who have held power long enough that people need the story to make sense of the fear. She had expected theater, studied intimidation, the performative dominance of a king who had learned to weaponize his presence. What she saw was a man in his late 30s who sat at the end of the table like a man who had been working since before dawn and would be working after midnight and had learned to carry that load so efficiently that it simply looked like stillness. He was built the way an alpha king was built, not merely large but architecturally capable, the kind of frame that had been shaped by actual use rather than display. But what struck her first and kept her attention was his face, specifically his eyes. He was watching her the way she watched people, not with the assessing hunger she'd braced for, with recognition. As if he already knew what he was looking at, as if he had been waiting for it. She filed that away and turned her attention to the physician. The assessment was exactly as thorough as Aldrich had promised. The physician, a small, precise man named Cordell, who spoke about bodies with the detached fluency of a man who had been doing this for 40 years, documented everything: her wolf silence, her bond dissolution, and its circumstances. The reproductive assessment, which he conducted with professional neutrality, and which she endured with the particular stripped bare dignity of someone who has been examined and found lacking so many times that the examination itself has lost its power to wound. Her blood pressure, her reflexes, the faint silver tracework under the skin of her left forearm that 3 previous physicians had attributed to a minor blood anomaly and dismissed. Cordell did not dismiss it. He stopped when he reached it. His hands, which had been moving with the continuous, efficient motion of long practice, went still. He held her arm in both of his and turned it toward the light from the high windows, and in the silence that followed, Lysera heard the woman in gray exhale a single quiet breath. "What is that?" Lysera asked. Cordell did not answer her immediately. He looked toward the far end of the table. Vaelor Dreadmore was looking at her arm. "It is," the king said, and his voice was the one thing the stories had gotten entirely right. Not loud, not theatrical, but carrying with the absolute certainty of a sound that did not need to compete because everything else instinctively made room for it. Exactly what I thought." "Your Majesty," the senior advisor said carefully, "if I may suggest we proceed with the standard documentation before—" "No." The king stood. He did not stand the way men stand when they are performing authority. He stood the way gravity works, not because it has decided to demonstrate itself, but because that is what it does. "Clear the hall." The assessment protocol requires all candidates to be evaluated before— "Marin." His tone did not change. It did not need to. "Clear the hall." The advisor stood so quickly, her chair scraped. The others followed with the synchronized efficiency of people who had learned that certain instructions from this particular man were non-negotiable. Within 45 seconds, the hall held 3 people. Vaelor Dreadmore, Cordell the physician, who had not moved from Lysera's side, and Lysera herself, sitting very still in a chair with her left arm extended, and her blood doing something she did not have a name for, not racing, not slow, but changed, vibrating at a frequency she had never felt before, as if something deep in her circulatory system had been struck like a tuning fork and was ringing and would not stop. "You can feel it," the king said. Not a question. He was crossing the room toward her with the particular unhurried directness of someone who had already decided what they were doing. "I don't know what I'm feeling," she said. "Yes, you do." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up, which she did without retreating because she had never retreated in her life and was not going to start in a white room in front of a man she had known for 4 minutes, and held out his hand, palm up. She looked at it. "What are you asking?" she said. "I'm not asking," he said. "I'm telling you what is about to happen. You're going to place your hand in mine, and the silver marking on your arm is going to respond, and then we are going to have a very different conversation than either of us prepared for today." He paused. "Or you don't. And we continue the assessment protocol, and in 3 days you go home, and for the rest of your life you wonder what the ringing means." It was, she thought, the most honest thing any person of authority had ever said to her. She placed her hand in his. The world cracked open, not metaphorically, not in the vague, poetic sense of expanded awareness or emotional revelation. The world cracked open the way the earth cracks in a quake, a fundamental, physical, irreversible alteration of structure. The silver marking on her left forearm blazed white hot, and she would have pulled back except that she couldn't, not because he was holding her there, but because the sensation was complete, total, an absolute claiming of every nerve in her body by something that had been waiting inside her for years and had simply been waiting for a key to fit the lock. Her wolf, not silent anymore, not buried, awake. She heard it like she heard her own heartbeat, not from outside, not arriving, but always already present, always already hers, suddenly and catastrophically audible. It was not small. It was not the ordinary bounded presence she had always assumed wolves were. It was vast in a way that made the white hall around her feel like a closet, in a way that made the limits of her own skin feel provisional, in a way that made 3 years of being told she was empty and barren and broken collapse inward and reveal themselves for what they had always been, a lie built on top of something too large to be safely known. "There she is," Valor Dreadmore said quietly, and in his voice was something she would spend weeks learning how to name. Not hunger, not triumph, relief. He had been looking for her, not for a queen, not for a body to bear heirs. He had been looking for this specific, terrible, awakening power, with the particular desperation of a man running out of time. She yanked her hand back. "What did you do to me?" Her voice was unsteady for the first time in 3 years, which was infuriating. "What is that? What did you—" "Nothing." He did not move back. "That was yours. Every piece of it was already yours." "Then why could I not feel it before?" His jaw tightened. It was the first crack in the absolute composure he had maintained since she entered the room, and she tracked it with the trained attention of a woman who had survived by reading what people tried not to show. Something was wrong, not with her, with the situation, with what her awakening meant. "Because," he said carefully, "there are people with a significant interest in ensuring the last of your bloodline never wakes up." "My bloodline." Her voice had gone flat again. Not because she had recovered the composure, but because the flatness was the only tool she had left when she was too overwhelmed for anything else. "What bloodline?" He looked at her for a long moment. In the physician's corner, Cordell was writing in a ledger with the focused silence of a man committed to not being part of this conversation. "Lysera Vale," Valor said. "Your maternal grandmother was Ressa Alden. Her mother before her was Camille Alden. And before her," he paused, "before her was Soline of the First Holders, who was the last acknowledged moon sovereign before the purge." The ringing in her blood got louder. "Moon sovereigns are extinct," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is what they wanted everyone to believe. They have been extinct for 300 years. Every lineage was scattered," he said, "hidden, renamed, sold off into obscurity and told they were broken and barren and less than they were, specifically and deliberately and with enormous systemic effort, so that what was in their blood would never wake up and remember what it was capable of." Something moved in his expression. Not pity, she would not accept pity, but something adjacent, something that understood. "You were not broken, Lysera. You were suppressed by people who needed you to believe you were nothing, because what you are is the most dangerous thing alive in this empire." She sat in the white chair in the white room with her left arm blazing silver and her wolf screaming awake after 3 years of silence and the entire architecture of her known self collapsing in real time. "I need you to tell me," she said very quietly, "who knew?" His silence was 3 seconds too long. "Who knew?" she repeated, and this time it was not a question. "That is what I was hoping you would not ask today," he said. "Who knew what I was when they submitted my name to your collector?" He looked at her, and in his eyes, behind the control and the relief and the careful management of what this moment was requiring of him, she saw the answer before he said it. "Your father submitted your name 6 months ago," he said, "but the name was flagged in our registry 4 years ago by someone with access to old bloodline documentation." He paused. "The formal suggestion that your name be considered for tribute came from a written recommendation, signed and sealed." Another pause. "By your former mate, Davin Holt." The room went entirely still. 3 years of dissolution documents. 3 years of hearing she was defective, barren, worthless, broken. 3 years of living in the servants' quarters of her own family home. 3 years of splitting wood in the pre-dawn frost because stillness had become too dangerous. And Davin Holt had known. He had known what she was. He had not rejected her because she was broken. He had discarded her to keep her suppressed, to keep her silent, to keep her buried. The silver light in her arm flared so bright it lit the walls, and from somewhere beneath the floor, or perhaps from somewhere beneath the foundation of everything she had been told she was, the wolf in her blood rose up and opened its eyes. And they were not the eyes of an ordinary wolf. They were the eyes of something that had been asleep for 300 years, and it was no longer interested in sleeping. The silver light did not fade. That was the first thing Valor noticed, not the awakening itself, which he had anticipated with the careful, contained anticipation of a man who has spent years preparing for a single moment, but the duration. In every documented account of Moon Sovereign activation he had studied, the initial flare lasted seconds. A surge, a recognition, and then the light pulled back inward as the bloodline recalibrated to its host. Lysera's light had been burning for 4 minutes. Cordell had stopped writing. She was sitting in the chair with both hands flat on her thighs and her jaw set, and her eyes, which had been dark brown when she walked into this room, cycling through something between silver and white the way a fire cycles through its hottest range. And she was breathing with the concentrated deliberateness of someone managing an experience that had exceeded the available vocabulary for it. Not panic. Panic was reactive, scattered, surrendered to the momentum of what was happening. This was something else. This was a woman taking the full measure of a catastrophic change and refusing to be reduced by it. Valor had seen a great many people face revelations in this room. He had never seen one face it like this. "The light," he said carefully. "Does it hurt?" "No." Her voice was clipped, functional, the voice of someone conserving resources. "It feels like—" She stopped, reconsidered, started again. "It feels like blood returning to a limb that fell asleep, except the limb is my entire—" Another stop. "I don't have the words for what it feels like." "You don't need them right now. Don't tell me what I need." He almost smiled. Under different circumstances, he would have. "Fair." She turned her head and looked at him with those cycling eyes, and he held the look without flinching because flinching was not something he had the structural capacity for anymore, and because what she needed from him in this moment was not softness, but steadiness. There is a difference. Softness bends under pressure. Steadiness does not move at all, which means it can be used as a fixed point when everything else is shifting. "Davin Holt," she said. "Yes." "He knew I was a Moon Sovereign. He knew you carried the bloodline, whether he understood the full scope of what that meant. Don't make it smaller than it is." Her voice was quiet and absolutely inflexible. "He dissolved our bond knowing I was suppressed. He filed the documentation calling me barren and defective knowing I was suppressed. He lived with me for 3 years and watched me believe I was broken." She stopped. A muscle in her jaw worked. The silver light pulsed once, hard, like a second heartbeat. "And then he wrote a letter recommending my name to your registry." "Yes." "Why?" That was the question he had been dreading. Not because he didn't have an answer, because the answer was the first thread of something much larger, and pulling it would unravel things she was not yet equipped to survive knowing. He weighed that calculation with the rapid, practiced precision of a man who had spent decades making decisions that cost people things and arrived at the same place he always arrived. The truth, delivered at the right speed, was always less damaging than the truth delivered too late. Because someone told him to, Valor said. Someone who wanted you inside this palace, inside these walls, where they could reach you. The room went quiet enough that he could hear the silver channels burning outside the windows. They sent me here, she said, to be accessible. That is my working theory, yes. Which means the people suppressing my bloodline and the people who sent me here are the same people, or aligned. He moved to the chair across from her and sat, which was a deliberate choice. Eye level, no physical advantage asserted, the posture of a man who understood that the next conversation required something other than authority. Which means I have a significant problem. You. Her tone was precise as a blade. You have a problem. We have a problem, he amended, because whoever arranged your arrival here anticipated that I would find you, that the activation would occur. That changes everything about how I handle the next 72 hours. She studied him the way she had been studying him since she walked through the door. Not with the performed deference he received from every other person in this building, and not with the aggressive challenge of people who needed to prove something, but with the flat, unsentimental assessment of a person who had learned to read the gap between what someone said and what they were actually managing. It was, he thought, the most exhausting and clarifying thing about her. She looked at him the way you looked at structural damage, not to judge it, but to understand exactly where the load was being carried. What, she said, is a moon sovereign actually capable of? I'll answer that, he said, but not here, not in a room where I cannot control the walls. He took her through corridors she suspected were not the corridors she was meant to know about. The palace had an official geography. The routes shown to guests, the paths used by staff, the grand processional halls designed to communicate the empire's weight to anyone passing through them. And then it had this: narrower passages behind load-bearing walls, staircases that appeared to lead nowhere, and opened into rooms that did not appear on any architectural plan she had been given. She cataloged each turn with the automatic attention she applied to all new environments. Old habit. The habit of someone who had spent years needing to know where the exits were. The room he brought her to was underground, not a dungeon. She registered that immediately. No damp, no iron, no smell of long-term confinement. The ceiling was low but intact, the walls cut from the same obsidian as the palace above, and every surface was covered in handwriting, not inscribed, written. In ink that had been applied directly to the stone in layers, generation upon generation of notation accumulating into a palimpsest so dense it had become its own texture. Maps. Genealogical lines. Words and languages she did not recognize, and one she almost did. In the center of the room was a table. On the table was a single lantern and a collection of documents that had clearly been in use recently. The lamp was still warm. Several pages showed fresh ink at the margins. He had been working on this before she arrived. You knew I was coming for longer than 11 days, she said. 14 months. He moved to the table and turned two of the documents toward her. I have been tracking your family's migration pattern against archived bloodline records since I found the first reference to a surviving Alden line descendant in a seized estate registry. He paused. The estate belonged to your maternal grandmother's second husband. He died 3 years ago. His household records were submitted to the crown as part of standard estate settlement. One clerk noticed a notation about a granddaughter. I noticed the notation about the notation. 14 months, she repeated. I had to be certain, and I had to move carefully because the people watching your bloodline are also watching me. She pulled one of the documents toward her. It was a genealogical chart, dense, exhaustively sourced, running in a vertical column down the center of the page with branching annotations on either side. She found the Aldon name 7 generations up, traced the line downward with her finger, watched it narrow through diaspora and concealment and strategic renaming until it arrived, at the bottom of the page, at a name she recognized. Her mother's name. And below it, in Valor Dreadmore's own handwriting, her own. Something happened in her chest that she did not have time for. She set it aside. The Vale Dominion, she said. The phrase had surfaced in the document's margins, circled twice in red. What is it? It is the entity that the Shadow Dynasty's founding king made a bargain with 3 centuries ago. Valor sat at the table with the contained energy of a man who had been waiting to say this to the right person for a very long time. In exchange for the power to unify the empire, the wolf-shifting capability passed through the royal bloodline, the ability to command pack loyalty across territories. The founding king agreed to a tithe, the firstborn child of every ruling generation. She was quiet. Not dead, he continued. Taken. Drawn into a realm the original texts call the veil, a space between what is real and what is not, where consciousness can be sustained indefinitely, but agency cannot, where the people taken there become sources of power rather than people. He paused. For 300 years, the Shadow Dynasty has honored that bargain. Every ruling line has lost its firstborn. Including yours, she said. The pause was 1 second. Including mine. She did not offer condolence. She understood from the way he'd said it that condolence was not what was needed. What was needed was the thing they were already doing. Staying in the facts, staying operational, not allowing the weight of what was true to collapse the structure of what had to be done. The Moon Sovereign bloodline, she said. What's its connection to the Veil? The Moon Sovereigns were the original counterweight. He stood and moved to the wall, pointing to a section of the dense written stone she hadn't yet parsed. The language here was older, the letters rounded differently, certain characters she didn't know. Before the Empire, before the Shadow Dynasty and its bargain, there was a different power structure in this territory, one built on moonfire. The sovereigns called it that, the capacity to illuminate what is hidden, to pull suppressed things into clarity, to break old agreements by exposing the terms. His finger traced a symbol she recognized from her left arm. The Veiled Dominion has been suppressing the moon bloodlines for 3 centuries because a living, awakened moon sovereign is the only force that can dissolve the bargain without paying the forfeit. She looked at her arm, at the silver tracing under her skin, blazing lower now but still present, still insisting on its own reality. And Davin Holt, she said slowly, dissolved our bond and arranged for me to be sent here so that I would walk into this palace and awaken and be inside these walls when whoever is working with the veil on the inside could access you, Valor finished. Yes, there is someone in this palace working with the Veiled Dominion. Almost certainly, and you don't know who. I have 4 suspects and insufficient evidence. She looked at him. He looked at her. The lantern between them burned steady. You brought me underground to tell me this, she said, which means you're concerned about who can hear conversations in the rooms above. I'm concerned about who can hear conversations everywhere. He moved back to the table. But this room was built by the 3rd king of this dynasty specifically to block the Veil's attention. The inscriptions on the walls are containment work. 1,400 years of accumulated shielding. A pause. It is the only place in this building I am certain we are not being watched. She thought about that for a moment, about what it meant to be a king who had inherited a throne built on a centuries-old debt to a darkness that watched everything, who lived and worked and made decisions in a building where he could trust exactly one room. How long have you known about the spy? She asked. 11 months. And you haven't moved against them. Without evidence, moving against a court figure creates more instability than it resolves. It signals that I know. It drives them underground. It closes the one visibility window I have. He said this with the flat precision of a man who had already had the argument with himself many times and arrived at the same answer. I have been waiting for a development that changes the calculus. And now you have one. Now I have you. It was not phrased as flattery. It was phrased as a military assessment, the arrival of a resource that had been anticipated and planned for. She knew the difference. She found, against her expectations, that she preferred it. I want to be clear about something, she said. Go ahead. I don't know you. I walked into this palace 4 hours ago. Everything you've told me tonight is unreferenced and unverifiable and could be an elaborate machinery designed to make me trust you quickly. She watched his face. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying I noticed the structure. He was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is exactly the right response. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth, not softness, but the particular quality of a man encountering a thing he had not expected and recalibrating accordingly. It is also why I'm telling you all of this now, rather than managing your information intake the way I manage everyone else's. Because you cannot be managed. not given what you are. He looked at her steadily. A moon sovereign's power is rooted in truth. Moonfire burns cleanest when it has full information. If I conceal things from you, I compromise the tool I need most. A pause. And I find I don't want to. The last sentence was different from the ones before it. Less strategic. More honest in the way that stripped back things are honest. Not because they've been prepared, but because they haven't. She filed it, carefully. What do we do now? She said. Tonight, nothing. You return to the Eastern Wing and you behave like a confused, overwhelmed woman who doesn't know what happened in the assessment room. Tomorrow, I begin the formal evaluation process. All 7 candidates presented to the court. You will be included. He paused. The court will not respond well. I expect not. What I need from you is to be exactly what you've been since you walked through my gates. Don't perform. Don't diminish yourself to manage their comfort. Don't explain. He held her gaze. Just stand there and be what you are. The court will do the rest. She considered that. You're using their contempt as a diagnostic tool. The people who react most aggressively to your presence will tell me a great deal about who has the most to lose from a moon sovereign awakening. He paused. Yes, she stood. The silver light in her arm had faded to a faint trace, still there if you knew to look. Invisible if you didn't. You've been alone with this for a long time, she said. Not a consolation, an observation. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I'll be in the Eastern Wing, she said, and she left. East. The walk back through the narrow corridors gave her time she did not particularly want. This is the particular cruelty of revelation. It does not wait for a convenient moment. It arrives in the middle of an assessment hall in a strange city with a single bag and bleeding palms, and it restructures everything you understood about your own life without asking for your consent. And then it sends you back to a room full of women who don't know any of it. Has happened to get a night's sleep before the next performance begins. 3 years of being told she was broken. 3 years of waking up before the shame did, picking up the heaviest thing available, keeping moving. Not broken, suppressed. The distinction was not academic. It was the difference between a verdict and a crime, between a condition and an action. Someone had done this to her. Not fate, not bad luck, not the simple statistical misfortune of being born into a diminished line. Someone with knowledge and intention and access had ensured that she would spend the formative years of her adult life believing she was less than she was. They had used the most intimate mechanism available, her mate bond, the person she had trusted most completely, to keep her buried. She thought about Davin Holt the way she always thought about him when she permitted herself to, methodically. In the first year after the dissolution, she had thought about him with the hot, destabilizing intensity of someone working through a wound that hadn't finished bleeding. By the second year, it had cooled into something flatter. Grief that had finished grieving, settled into the scar tissue of fact. He was gone. What they had been was gone. She had cataloged its absence and moved forward. Now she had to recatalog the whole thing, because what she had filed under bad luck and personal failure was actually something else. Something done to her by a man who had known what she was and had chosen, deliberately and with apparent coordination from larger forces, to keep her small. The question was not whether she was angry. She was furious. It sat in her chest like a coal, not flaring, not consuming, but utterly and permanently hot. The question was what she would do with it. Rage, undirected, is just weather. It blows through and leaves damage and provides no structural material for what needs to be built afterward. Rage, directed with precision, is something else. It is the thing that makes a person stop accepting limits that were never theirs to accept. She had been accepting limits for 3 years. She was done. The Eastern Wing was quieter when she returned. 2 of the candidates had retired. The copper-haired girl, whose name she had learned from a passing maid, was Lysera Fenwick, daughter of the wealthiest pack lord in the Northern Territories, was still awake, seated near the window with a document she was studying with the focused intensity of someone reviewing strategy before a contest. She looked up when Lysera entered. "The assessment took 4 times longer for you than for any of us," Lysera said. No preamble. Direct in the way people who were accustomed to being the most capable person in the room were direct. Not rude, just economical, with social lubrication. What happened? Blood anomaly, Lysera said. She removed her coat and hung it on the hook beside her bed with deliberate normality. Physician wanted to document it fully. They sent everyone else out. I noticed. They've never cleared the assessment hall before. Not in any prior assembly. Lysera set the document down. My family has been participating in imperial assemblies for 4 generations. I was briefed on every protocol. Lysera looked at her. Lysera Fenwick was watching her with the sharp, structured intelligence of someone who had been raised to understand that information was power, and that unaccounted-for information was a threat. She was not hostile, she was calculating. There was a difference. Your family briefed you on every protocol, Lysera said, because they need you to win. They need someone in this house to win. Lysera's voice was flat with a specific kind of flatness. The flatness of someone who has fully metabolized an uncomfortable truth. Ideally me. I am the best candidate they have produced in 2 generations by every measurable metric. I have full wolf activation, impeccable lineage, strong political alliances, and a working understanding of court mechanics that most women my age lack entirely. A pause. And the king rejected me in 45 minutes. He rejected everyone in 45 minutes. He spent nearly 2 hours with you. Lysera looked at Lysera's left arm, where the silver trace had faded to near invisible. I've been trying to figure out what you have that I don't. I don't know, Lysera said. It was technically true. Lysera studied her for a long moment with those sharp, calculating eyes. Then something shifted. Not softening, exactly, but a strategic recalculation. The look of a person deciding that competition was less useful than information sharing. You should know, Lysera said, that 3 of the women in this wing were placed here by families with court affiliations I consider unstable. Lady Vorn's father has been meeting privately with the Morthen House Council for 6 months, which matters because House Morthen's senior advisor has been absent from court for the past year without documented reason. She paused. Lord Askenfeld's daughter, the tall one, Brea, is pleasant but reports everything she hears to her eldest brother, who is not pleasant. Lysera sat on the edge of her bed. Why are you telling me this? Because I have spent my entire life being prepared to win a game that the king apparently doesn't want to play. Lysera's voice had lost its performing edge, become something more tired and more real. And I am trying to understand what game he is actually playing. You walked in here with nothing, and he cleared the room. That tells me the rules I was given are wrong. A pause. I would rather know what the actual rules are than keep playing by bad ones. This, Lysera thought, was a genuinely intelligent person, operating under genuinely bad information, making the best possible recalibration given available data. She felt something almost like respect, more than she'd expected to feel toward anyone in this room. I can't tell you what happened in the assessment, she said, not because I'm protecting something from you, because I don't fully understand it yet myself. She looked at Lysera directly. What I can tell you is that the reason you were rejected in 45 minutes is not because you're deficient. Then what is it? He wasn't looking for the best candidate. He was looking for a specific one. Lysera processed that. You. Apparently, a long silence. Outside, the silver fire channels burned in the dark. That is deeply inconvenient for my family, Lysera said, finally. I imagine so. They will not accept it quietly. I didn't expect they would. Another silence. Then Lysera picked up her document again with the brisk efficiency of someone deciding that catastrophizing was a waste of time and returning to what was actionable. Get some sleep. The formal presentation is at midday tomorrow, and the court observers will arrive at first light. A pause. Wear something that doesn't look like you split wood in it. Lysera almost laughed. She did not, but it was close. Want. Midday came with the weight of theater. The formal presentation hall was everything the assessment room wasn't. Vast, deliberately overwhelming, built to remind the people standing in it that they were small and temporary, while the institution they were entering was large and permanent. The ceiling was 40 feet of carved obsidian vaulting, every arch studded with silver fire channels that threw the whole space into that characteristic cold, bright ambiance of the shadow court. The floor was black stone polished to mirror quality. The galleries above were already populated, court members and their retinues arranged in the carved viewing spaces that ran around three walls. The soft collective murmur of people who had gathered to watch something they had been told was a performance and were about to receive a complication. 8 women walked in a line. 7 of them had been dressed by the palace's court attendants in formal presentation garments. Deep jewel tones, the kind of richly structured clothing that announced serious bloodline investment. Lysera was the 8th. She was wearing the best dress she owned, which was the second of her 2 changes of clothes. Dark blue wool, well cut for its modest origins, maintained with the obsessive practicality of someone for whom clothing was function rather than performance. Against the other 7 women, it was conspicuous in the way that simplicity is conspicuous when surrounded by assertion. She heard the murmur from the gallery shift when it reached her. She kept her eyes forward. This is what they don't tell you about surviving contempt. It is not the contempt itself that is hardest to bear. It is the moment just before the contempt arrives, when you know it's coming, and your body wants to preemptively flinch, to make yourself smaller, to diminish to the size they've decided you are. The whole mechanism of suppression lives in that moment, in the body's learned instinct to solve the threat of social violence by becoming less of a target. She kept her spine straight. She had stopped making herself small. The king was already seated when they entered, not on the formal throne, which stood behind and above the presentation dais, but in the central chair of a curved arrangement that spoke to judgment rather than ceremony. He was dressed as she had seen him before, in the severe, dark practicality of someone who wore authority like weather, not as a decision, but as a condition. He did not look at the line of women as they filed in. He was reading a document in his left hand with the focused inattention of a man completing the last piece of one task before beginning another. To his right, Aldrich Voss standing with the contained stillness of a man performing unobtrusiveness. To his left, a woman Lysera had not yet been introduced to, tall, perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had been beautiful and had allowed itself to become formidable instead. Silver-streaked hair pulled back without concession to ornament, eyes the dark amber of old honey. She was watching the line of women walk in with an expression that would have been unreadable to someone who hadn't spent 3 years reading what people tried not to show. She was watching Lysera with the careful attention of someone confirming a fear. That, Lysera catalogued, was worth knowing. The court official stepped forward and began the formal announcements. Name, lineage, pack affiliation, documented wolf activation status, the compressed biography of each woman reduced to its politically relevant facts. Each announcement was met with the gallery's running commentary, quiet but audible. The social calculation of court observers assigning value in real time. Then, Lysera Vale, Southern Vale, lesser branch. No current pack affiliation. Wolf activation status. Assessment inconclusive. A pause. Not scripted. A genuine hesitation from the official, who had clearly been wrestling with how to characterize what the paperwork from yesterday described. Bloodline classification under review. The gallery did not murmur. It spoke, not loudly. Courts of this caliber expressed their opinions in layers: the initial reaction, the neighbor consultation, the revised reaction, the calculated display of the revised reaction. What she heard from above was the rapid overlapping mechanics of a room of politically sophisticated people encountering information that did not fit their existing framework and deciding what position to adopt before someone more powerful established one first. She can't shift, someone said, not quietly enough. They brought a woman who can't shift to an imperial assembly. The Vale line is minor nobility at best. Why is she here? Baylor Dreadmore set down his document. The hall went silent the way a room goes silent when a large predator adjusts its attention, not from instruction, but from the body's instinctive prioritization of where the danger was. He looked at Lysera, not at the line, not at the 7 other women who represented the careful, exhausting ambition of their families and bloodlines. At her, with the same direct, undeflected attention he had given her yesterday in the assessment room, delivered now in front of 400 people, which changed its meaning entirely. "Lady Vale," he said. She had not been called Lady anything in 3 years. The title sat on her like a coat that almost fit. Familiar in structure, strange in the wearing. "Your Majesty," she said, "step forward." She stepped forward, one step out from the line, which put her 3 feet ahead of the other 7 women and directly in the eye line of the king, the court, and the woman with amber eyes who was now watching with an intensity she was no longer trying to conceal. "You were told you could not shift," he said. Still that level, factual delivery. Not a weapon, just a truth being examined. By the physicians who assessed you after your bond dissolution. Yes. How many physicians? 2 Imperial certified, 1 healer from the pack my former mate, was affiliated with. And you believed them. Something moved behind her sternum. She kept it off her face. I had no evidence to the contrary. No. He let that sit for a moment. I am going to ask you something in front of this court, and I want you to understand that the question is genuine, not ceremonial. He paused. What did it feel like when your wolf went silent? The gallery had gone so quiet she could hear the silver fire burning in the wall channels. This was not a question anyone had ever asked her. Not the physicians, not her family, not the social machinery of an empire that categorized women by their capacities and moved on when the capacities came up short. No one had ever asked what it felt like. She took one breath. Like amputation, she said. Except the limb wasn't gone. You could still feel the shape of where it had been. Just nothing there when you reached for it. Nothing answering. She paused. And everyone around you had an opinion about what it meant, about what you were worth without it. Another pause, colder. I became very good at believing them. The hall was completely still. He nodded once. That belief, he said, was manufactured, deliberately, by people with a specific interest in keeping your bloodline silent. He looked up from her then, for the first time, and swept his gaze across the galleries with the unhurried authority of a man who was about to make a statement that would not be contradicted. What stood in this hall before me today has more inherent power than any bloodline this empire has produced in 3 centuries, and it came in wearing a wool dress with a single bag, because the system I was born into spent 27 years teaching it that it was nothing, not a declaration, an indictment. The galleries did not murmur. They absorbed. Then, from the left gallery, the section where the wealthiest pack lords maintained their court positions, a voice, male, carrying the particular projection of a man accustomed to having his volume function as authority. This is irregular. The assembly protocols require... Lord Fenwick. The king's voice did not rise. You are welcome to file a formal objection through the court registry. I will read it with the attention it deserves. A pause so brief it was almost not a pause at all. Sit down. Lord Fenwick sat down. In the line behind her, Lysera heard Lysera Fenwick breathe very slowly through her nose. The reaction came in the afternoon. She had expected it, in the way you expect weather when you can see the clouds building, the shape of it, the rough timing, the basic nature of the system moving in. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the speed. Courts this size moved slower in her imagination. In practice, the social mechanics of 400 politically motivated people processing a common threat and coordinating response operated with terrifying efficiency. By the 3rd hour after the presentation, 3 separate delegations had requested private audiences with the king. The court physician had been summoned twice. A written document circulated through the gallery sections. She caught a glimpse of it being passed between 2 women in the upper tier. That appeared to be a compiled objection of some kind, already gathering signatures. And in the corridor outside the eastern wing, Aldrich Voss found her. His Majesty requests your presence at the evening council. He said it with the same neutral professionalism he applied to everything, which she had come to understand was not indifference, but a professional commitment to not letting his own reactions shape other people's responses. Formal dress. An hour before the evening meal. I don't have formal dress. The court wardrobe attendant has been instructed. He paused. Something moved in his expression that was as close as she had yet seen him come to personal investment. You handled this morning well. I answered a question. You answered a question in front of 400 people who were waiting for you to collapse, and you didn't collapse. In my experience, that is the most difficult thing anyone in this court has ever done. He paused. I've been the collector for 22 years. I have conducted 43 tribute assemblies. I have never submitted a name to His Majesty myself. He let that settle. Until you. She looked at him. You submitted my name? The senior collector has override authority in cases where assessment criteria are insufficient to evaluate a candidate's potential. He held her gaze steadily. I found your name in the Vale Estate Registry. I recognize the Alden bloodline signature in the notation. I submitted your name over the objections of every protocol I have spent 22 years following. A pause. I need you to understand that I was not certain I was right. But you submitted it anyway. Yes, she thought about that. About a man in an expensive coat riding into a frost-covered yard and dismounting to hold a horse's reins while a woman with bleeding palms packed a single bag. About the careful neutrality he'd maintained for 11 days while she pieced herself back together on the road. Not asking, not pressing, simply providing reliable steadiness at appropriate intervals. Thank you, she said. It was not a gracious thank you. It was not a grateful thank you. It was a precise one. The acknowledgement of a specific thing done at a specific cost, which was the only kind of thanks that meant anything. He nodded, turned to leave, stopped. The woman in gray at the assessment, he said. Her name is Saren. She is the king's longest-serving advisor and the closest thing he has to a genuine ally in this court. A pause. She was the one who insisted he keep looking for you when 17 months of searching had produced nothing. He paused once more, very briefly. She will want to speak with you, alone, before the council. He looked back at her over his shoulder. Trust your instincts. They are, in my observation over 4 decades of assessing people, very good. He left. Saren found her 30 minutes later. She moved through the wing corridor the way water moved through narrow stone. Without announcing the arrival, simply present when you looked up. Close in, she was even more formidable than she had appeared in the assessment room. The kind of formidable that was not performed and not aggressive. The bone-deep, accumulated formidable of a person who had spent 40 years being the most intelligent person in most rooms and had stopped needing to demonstrate it. Walk with me, she said. It was not phrased as a request. They walked. I'm going to tell you 3 things, Saren said, moving through the corridor at a pace that was brisk without appearing urgent. The first is that what happened in the assessment room yesterday has not been contained. The physician's notes are secured, but the light from your arm was visible under the door. 3 court servants reported it. By now, the people I have been watching for 11 months know that you activated. Which means they'll move faster, Lysera said. Yes. The timeline I was working with assumed a gradual revelation, controlled exposure, managed court response. That timeline is no longer available. Saren didn't look at her, kept her eyes on the corridor ahead. The second thing is that the woman you need to be most cautious of in this court is not one of the 4 suspects Vialor has identified. Lysera processed that. There's a fifth. She has been in this building for 16 years. She's very good at being trusted and very practiced at being overlooked. She will approach you in the next 24 hours with something that looks like an offer of support. A pause. It will not be. You're not going to tell me who. I'm going to let your instincts identify her. Because if I tell you, you will be watching for what I describe. And she is good enough to not match the description. Saren finally looked at her briefly, sideways. Your instincts are strong enough. Use them. The third thing, Lysera prompted. Saren stopped walking. They were at the end of the corridor in a small alcove near a window that looked down over an interior courtyard, one of the palace's breathing spaces, a square of pale stone with a bare tree at its center, the branches ice-laden, the whole thing a study in winter patience. The third thing, Saren said quietly, is that Valor has not told you the full scope of what a Moon Sovereign's activation means for the ruling bond. She paused. He will tell you tonight. I am telling you now so you have time to consider it before he does, because in the moment he tells you, he will be watching your reaction, and the reaction he most fears, the one that would undo everything we have worked toward, is you deciding to leave. Lysera was very still. The ruling bond, Saren continued, Between a Shadow King and the force he inherited from the founding bargain is a one-way tether. It connects him to the Vale Dominion. It is what gives the Shadow bloodline its power. It is also what will eventually consume him. She looked at the courtyard, the ice-laden tree, the patient, waiting branches. Every Shadow King has known, from the moment they accepted the crown, that the Vale would one day call in the full debt. Not just the firstborn tithe, the king himself. A pause. Valor has known this since he was 16 years old. The corridor was silent. A moon sovereign, Saren said, is the only being capable of severing that tether without destroying the person it is attached to. Without the moonfire dissolution, the only way to break the ruling bond is death. She looked at Lysera now, directly, with those amber eyes that had seen 40 years of this court and were not asking for anything except attention. He has been searching for you for 14 months, not only to save future generations from the Vale tithe. He has been searching for you because without you, the debt will be called within the year. And when it is called, the empire loses its king. Lysera's hands were completely still at her sides. He's dying, she said. He will be taken, Saren corrected, which in practical terms is the same thing, and in lived terms is worse. The silver trace on Lysera's left arm began, very softly, to glow. Not brightly, not the flare of the assessment room, just a faint, steady luminescence. The moonfire responding to information the way it had been responding to true things since it woke, burning hotter in the presence of what was real. He had searched for her for 14 months. He had found her in an estate registry, in a single notation about a woman everyone had written off. He had sent his collector through 11 days of frost to bring her from a woodpile to this. Not for a queen, not for an heir, because he was running out of time and she was the only thing that could stop the clock. And he had told her almost everything tonight except the part that would have made her trust him completely and given her the most leverage over him. The part that made his need for her personal rather than strategic. He had held that back. Not to deceive, she didn't think, but because a man who had spent years carrying this alone had not yet learned how to put it down in front of another person without bracing for the moment they walked away. She thought about that, about a king who had been told since he was 16 that the throne he would inherit came with a countdown attached to it, and who had spent his reign not collapsing under that knowledge but building, fortifying, searching, working toward the one possibility that could change the outcome, because giving up on possibility was not in his structure any more than it was in hers. Two people, she thought, who had separately been told by the machinery of power that they were locked into a particular ending, and who had both refused to accept it. When the council meets tonight, she said, and he tells me, you will not walk away, Saren said. Not an instruction, a statement. The voice of a woman who had spent 16 years watching this king and had made a calculation about the woman standing in front of her. Lysera looked at the ice-laden tree in the courtyard, the bare branches holding their weight, patient, not broken, just waiting for the season to change. No, she said quietly, I will not. She turned and walked back toward the wing to prepare for the council. Behind her she heard Saren exhale, a single, long breath, with the sound of a woman releasing something she had been holding for a very long time. The council chamber was half full when she arrived, 12 people seated around an oval table of black stone. Aldrich Voss. 3 senior advisors she did not yet know by name. 2 military commanders with the weathered, unsentimental bearing of people who had spent their careers making irreversible decisions. The court physician Cordell. 2 figures she identified from gallery positions during the presentation, court lords of significant standing, and the woman with amber eyes, who was already watching the door when Lysera walked through it, and the amber-eyed woman's neighbor, who smiled at Lysera with the warm, calibrated friendliness of someone very practiced at being trusted, who she had never seen before, who felt immediately and entirely wrong. The instincts Aldrich had mentioned, the ones built over 3 years of learning to read what people tried not to show, fired hard and clean, and Lysera kept walking to her assigned seat with her face giving away nothing at all, filing the woman's face and the precise quality of the wrongness away in the part of her mind that held information she intended to use. Valor entered last. The room stood. He He waved them down without ceremony and moved directly to the head of the table with the focus of a man who had exactly the amount of time required and not 1 minute more. By tomorrow morning, he said without preamble, the formal objection to Miss Vale's inclusion in the assembly will have 40 signatures. By the afternoon session, it will have 60. He laid 2 documents on the table. I'm going to address that objection by eliminating the assembly entirely. Silence. Your Majesty, the senior advisor began, the Imperial Assembly was designed to identify a queen. I am not looking for a queen. He looked at each person at the table in sequence. Not aggressive, not performing, simply direct. The directness of a man who has stopped having time for the theater of power. I am looking for the person who can do what needs to be done. I have found her. The assembly is over. He turned to Lysera. Miss Vale, in the presence of this council, I am formally withdrawing the assembly proceedings and submitting a direct request for your consideration as Empress of the Shadow Dynasty. Not queen, Empress. The table erupted. Not in shouting. This was not the kind of room that shouted. In the rapid, overlapping collision of people processing an enormous shock and calculating its implications simultaneously. The senior advisor was speaking to the military commander on his left. Cordell had gone very still. The warm, smiling woman across the table had let her smile drop entirely, and in its absence her face showed something that was the first honestly expressed thing Lysera had seen from her. Fear. Not of Lysera, of what Lysera's elevation meant for whatever this woman had been building toward. Lysera looked at Valor. He was looking at her, waiting. She understood suddenly and completely what this moment was. Not a proposal, a detonation. He had just thrown a lit match into the room to see where the fire ran, and somewhere in the council chamber someone was burning. I accept your consideration, she said, into the noise, clearly enough to be heard. Pending further discussion. The room went quiet, and from the far end of the table, the woman who had smiled too warmly said, in a voice suddenly stripped of warmth entirely, "This will not be permitted." 7 heads turned toward her, including Valor's, and in the half-second before her expression locked back down, Lysera saw what Saren had told her to trust her instincts to find. Not an advisor, not a court lord, a messenger, a conduit. Something wearing a person's face and sitting in a council chamber and waiting for exactly this moment, the moment the Moon Sovereign accepted a position of power, to do what she had been placed here to do. The silver on Lysera's arm blazed white, the lanterns in the council chamber guttered, and from somewhere beneath the palace, in the old obsidian stone that had held secrets for 1400 years, something answered. The woman's name was Selene Vrath. Lysera learned this in the 3 seconds of absolute silence that followed the guttering of the lanterns. Learned it not from an introduction, not from a document, but from the way Valor's face changed when he looked at her. The particular quality of a man encountering a betrayal he had prepared for intellectually and was now meeting in the body, where preparation counts for nothing and the shock arrives clean regardless. He knew her, not as a threat, as something else, something that made the muscle at his jaw work once, hard, before he locked it back down. The lanterns restabilized. The silver fire in the wall channels flared and settled. Lysera's arm was still burning. Not the white blaze of activation, but a sustained directed heat, the moonfire doing what Saren had described it doing, illuminating what was real. What was real was that Selene Vrath was not afraid of the king. She was afraid of Lysera. That distinction was the most important thing in the room. Vrath. Valor's voice had changed, not louder, stripped. The particular vocal register of a man removing every layer of social management and speaking from the floor of himself. How long? Your Majesty, the senior advisor started. Marin. He did not look away from Selene. Be quiet. Selene Vrath sat very still. She was perhaps 45, with the kind of unremarkable face that was itself a form of camouflage. Not plain, not striking, simply forgettable. The face of someone who had spent years cultivating invisibility as a strategic resource. She had been in this court for 16 years. Saren had told Lysera she was practiced at being overlooked. In the silence of the council chamber, with 12 people staring at her and the king's attention fixed on her with the focused weight of a man who had just reconfigured everything he thought he knew, She looked like a person shedding a skin she had worn so long it had become structural. "Long enough," she said. The admission was not what anyone at the table expected. Denial would have been the move. The plausible deniability of someone who could argue the outburst was emotion, misread, taken out of context. Instead, she sat with her hands flat on the table and her face open in a way it hadn't been since Lysera walked into the room, and she looked at Valor with something that was almost grotesquely, given the moment, relief. This is what extended deception does to a person. It is not the dramatic unmasking of villains and stories, the revealed contempt, the triumphant drop of pretense. It is quieter and more corrosive than that. A person who has maintained a lie across 16 years of daily contact has spent 16 years managing the distance between what they show and what they are, and that management has a cost that compounds with interest. When the lie finally ends, what surfaces first is not defiance. It is the exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down. "They have the lower passages," Celine said. "They've had them for 6 months. Every conversation in the shielded room." She paused, looked at Lysera. "Everything you were told in the underground chamber last night was received." The underground chamber. The one room Valor had said was certain. The one space in the palace he had trusted. Lysera watched him absorb that. There is a specific kind of damage that comes from having your last secured position breached. It is not the damage of a frontal assault, which a person braced for impact can metabolize and push through. It is the damage of discovering that the ground you were standing on was not ground. It goes into the foundation. It makes you question every surface you have trusted since, not just the one that gave way, but all of them. Valor stood at the head of the table and Lysera watched him take that hit with the locked, absolute stillness of a man refusing to let anyone in this room see how deep it went. "Everything," he said. "Everything." "How?" "The shielding inscriptions were compromised in stages. I had access to the chamber twice in the past 3 years for legitimate maintenance requests. Each time I introduced a disruption in the fourth wall sequence." She said it without drama, without self-justification, the flat recitation of a person giving a damage report. It wouldn't have been detectable without a full re-audit of the inscription work. There was no reason to conduct one. Valor turned away from the table. One motion, precise and contained. He walked to the window at the far end of the chamber and stood with his back to the room. The set of his shoulders was controlled. Everything else in that posture was not. The council table sat in the particular collective silence of people who have just witnessed something catastrophic and are managing competing imperatives. The instinct to speak, the instinct to calculate, and the overriding instinct, in a room with a dangerous man who has just discovered he has been betrayed, to not become the next focus of his attention. Lysera looked at Saren. Saren's face was a study in controlled devastation. She had known there was a fifth suspect. She had not known it was this woman, or she would have named her. The amber eyes were doing rapid, silent recalculation, building a new map from the rubble of the old one, because that was what Saren did and had been doing for 40 years, and would keep doing because the alternative was paralysis, and paralysis was not available. "Who else?" Lysera said. Every head turned toward her. She had not spoken loudly, but the clarity of the question, direct, tactical, moving immediately past the shock to what was actually useful, cut through the room's stunned collective inertia the way a blade cuts through fabric. Celine looked at her. Something moved in the woman's expression. Not respect exactly, but recognition. The look of a person who had spent years underestimating a specific force and was now recalibrating in real time. In the court, I don't know. The veil doesn't share its full network. I was a node, not a map. She paused. Outside the court, your former mate is one contact point. There are 3 others in the Northern Pact territories, 1 in the Imperial Military Command. The military commander across the table went very still. "Not you," Celine said, looking at him with the weary precision of someone who had been managing these details for years. "Harvin Colt, the Southern Division commander. Colt has been with the army for 22 years, the commander said. His voice was flat with the specific flatness of a man struggling not to sound affected by news that had just restructured his professional understanding of the past 2 decades. 22 years is long enough to be turned, Celine said, especially if the turning happened early. Valor turned back from the window. Whatever he had done in those 40 seconds with his back to the room had been sufficient. Not recovery. That would take longer, and Lysera suspected it would come in the hours before dawn when there was no one to present steadiness to. But functional. The face he brought back to the table was the face of a king who had taken catastrophic new information and integrated it into operational reality, because that was the only move available. "You will be confined," he said to Celine. Not cruel, not punishing in its tone. The voice of a man making a practical decision. "Not to a cell, to your quarters under guard. This council will reconvene in the morning." He looked around the table. "What was discussed in this chamber tonight does not leave this chamber. If it does—" He paused. "I will know. Because now I know exactly how information leaves rooms it shouldn't leave." The council disbanded with the subdued efficiency of people carrying news they weren't permitted to share and bodies that had not yet finished processing what they'd seen. Lysera did not go back to the eastern wing. She went to the window alcove where Saren had told her the third thing, the place overlooking the courtyard with the ice-laden tree. And she stood there in the dark with her left arm cooling and her mind doing the work that needed to be done, which was rebuilding the map. Start from what was certain. The underground chamber was compromised. Everything Valor had told her there had been received by the Veil network, which meant the Veil knew she had activated, knew the scope of what she was, knew that Valor had told her about the ruling bond and its timeline, knew she had accepted his consideration for Empress. They had moved fast in the council chamber, Celine's outburst, the declaration that it would not be permitted, because the timetable had collapsed. The careful, staged approach was no longer available to them. If they intended to prevent a moon sovereign from taking a position of institutional power, they now had hours, not days, which meant she had hours. She heard footsteps that she recognized, not from their sound, but from their weight and spacing, the particular way a large person moved who had learned to move quietly and did not turn around. "You should have told me about the bond," she said. Valor stopped beside her. Not close. A person's width of distance, which in the present context felt both deliberate and slightly futile. "Yes," he said. "Saren told me." "I know. I asked her to." She looked at him then. He was looking at the courtyard, at the same ice-laden tree she had been looking at. The profile of a man carrying something very specific. Not guilt, not exactly, but the particular weight of a person who has been managing a countdown alone for years and has just, for the first time, permitted another person to know the clock exists. "You couldn't say it yourself," she said. "I have told 3 people in this world about the debt's final term," he said. "Saren, Aldrich, Cordell. In each case, I told them because I needed them to understand operational parameters, not because—" He stopped. "Not for any other reason." "And you couldn't tell me that way." A pause. "No," he said. "I could not." She processed that. There is a particular kind of exposed honesty that arrives not in the words a person says, but in the ones they cannot say. The gaps in the architecture where the structure is too personal to be translated into operational language. She had spent 3 years in a relationship with a man who communicated entirely in managed surfaces. She knew the difference between a person controlling what they showed and a person who had simply hit the limit of their own available language. "The lower passages," she said, returning to the territory of what was actionable. "If the Veil has had them for 6 months, then everything I've been planning for the past 6 months has been visible to them." He said it without inflection, the voice of a man looking at a collapsed structure and assessing which walls were still load-bearing. Every resource allocation, every timeline for your identification and retrieval, the full scope of what I know about the Moonfire dissolution process. "They let it proceed," Lysera said slowly. "They didn't move to stop it earlier. They let you find me. Let me be brought here. Let the activation happen." "Yes, because they needed me inside the palace. Because," he said, "an unactivated Moon Sovereign is a risk they can manage through continued suppression. An activated Moon Sovereign outside Imperial walls, unreachable, ungovernable, able to move and build alliances and eventually act from a position of her own construction." He paused. "That is a different problem. So they let me do the work of finding you and activating you and bringing you inside walls they already controlled. The full shape of it settled in Lysera's mind with the cold, heavy clarity of something that had been designed by patient, long-thinking intelligence. Not improvisation, not reaction. A plan that had been running in parallel with Veilor's plan for years, using his own search as its mechanism of delivery. He had been their instrument, and she had been his. Davin, she said, was their asset from the beginning, almost certainly placed in your path deliberately. The bond dissolution, the documented deficiency claims, the referral to my registry, all coordinated. Staged to arrive, you here activated and enclosed and surrounded by people, at least some of whom answer to the veil. She had known this, in the intellectual sense, since last night. But knowing a thing in the mind and knowing it in the body are different processes, and the body is slower and more honest. She stood at the window and let herself feel the full, unmediated weight of what it meant. Not just the betrayal of Davin, which she had already metabolized once and was now metabolizing again at a different depth, but the larger shape of it. The years. The careful systemic architecture of her diminishment. The number of hands and decisions and deliberate cruelties that had been required to produce a woman standing in a frost-covered yard believing she was nothing. It takes an enormous amount of organized effort to make a powerful thing believe it is powerless. She had spent years thinking her smallness was a natural condition. It was not. It was a managed one. And that distinction between something you were and something that was done to you was the difference between accepting a fate and refusing one. The silver trace on her arm pulsed once. Steady, certain. What do we do? She said. What I need to do tonight is secure the lower passages and identify which guards have been turned. What I need you to do is... He paused. She looked at him. I need you to be somewhere I can be certain is safe. And I no longer have a location I can guarantee. He said it with the flat, stripped precision of a man delivering a situation report that cost him something to deliver. I built my security architecture around that chamber. Without it, you're telling me you can't protect me. I'm telling you that the systems I built to protect you have been used against you. There is a difference. The practical result is the same. Yes, she thought. The eastern wing was accessible. Her room was not secured. 7 other women who had varying degrees of allegiance to families with varying degrees of involvement in what was now clearly a multi-actor conspiracy. Saren, whose location she didn't know. Aldrich, who was trustworthy but not a physical protection resource. Cordell, who was loyal but a physician. And a palace full of passages that answered to something older and darker than any of the people walking through them. The inscription work on the lower chamber walls, she said. Celine disrupted the 4th wall sequence. Yes. The first 3 walls are intact. He looked at her. Partial shielding doesn't... I know what partial shielding doesn't do. She turned away from the window, already moving. Show me the chamber. The damage was visible to the moonfire in a way it apparently was not visible to human eyes. Lysera stood in the underground room with the dense written walls and looked at what Celine Vrath had introduced into the inscription work across 6 months of careful, incremental corruption, and she could see it the way she imagined trained engineers could see structural stress in load-bearing walls. Not as absence, but as wrongness, the particular signature of something that had been altered from its original purpose. It was elegant work. She hated that she could see its elegance. 3 deliberate disruptions in the 4th wall sequence, each one microscopic in isolation, collectively sufficient to create a gap in the shielding just wide enough for a signal to pass through. Not a door. A crack. The difference between a wall that contained everything and a wall that contained everything except whispers. Veilor stood behind her with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression she was learning to read as him managing something he didn't want on his face. If the first 3 sequences are intact, she said, the room still blocks physical access. The veil can listen, but it can't reach in. The distinction matters less than it did yesterday. It matters enough. She turned to face him. I need ink. The same composition as the original inscription work. Cordell will know the formula. It's a standard archival compound. And I need 2 hours. He stared at her. You're going to repair the shielding. I'm going to try. The moonfire reads the inscription, work the way it reads everything, as either true or corrupted. If I can identify the exact disruption points, I can reinscribe them. She paused. I've never done this before. I'm extrapolating from an ability I've had for 48 hours. So I'm telling you it might not work. And if it doesn't, then we're exactly where we are now and we've lost 2 hours. She held his gaze. But if it does, we have one secured room in a compromised palace, which is one more than we currently have. He looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man recalibrating, again, rapidly, in the way she was learning was his constant operational mode, adjusting his understanding of what resource he was actually working with. "I'll get Cordell," he said. "Bet." She worked for 3 hours, not 2. The ink was cold and the stone was resistant, and the moonfire in her arm ached with the particular deep muscle ache of sustained, unfamiliar use, the way new runners felt in their shins on the 3rd day of training. She sat cross-legged on the stone floor in front of the damaged sections of the 4th wall and worked with the focused, granular attention of someone who had spent years splitting wood before dawn, not because the task was comfortable, but because the task was what was in front of her, and she did not have the luxury of doing it badly. Veilor sat at the table with his documents and worked. He did not watch her. This, she understood without being told, was a deliberate choice, not indifference, but the particular respect of a person who understood that sustained focus required not being observed. He had brought 2 additional lanterns and a plate of food from the kitchen that she ate without looking up, mechanically, because the body needed fuel and the work needed her full attention, and those 2 facts could be managed simultaneously. Cordell checked her progress at the midpoint, made 2 corrections to the inscription formula she had been using, and left. At the 3rd hour, the moonfire in her arm blazed white for one brief, clean instant, and the wall sealed. She sat on the cold floor and breathed for a moment. "Done," she said. Veilor set down his document. He looked at the wall, and she watched him look at it. Not with relief, not with triumph, but with the quiet, weight-bearing gratitude of a man who has been given back one thing he thought was permanently gone. "The council meets in 4 hours," he said. "Celine will be present under guard. I intend to conduct a formal examination." He paused. "I need you there." "Why?" "Because the moonfire identifies corruption." He looked at her steadily. "And I no longer trust my own assessment of who in that room is what they claim to be." She understood what he was asking. Not for the moonfire as a weapon, as a truth instrument. The ability to see what was real used in service of a king who had just discovered that his map of reality had been drawn by people who needed him to be wrong about where the walls were. She thought about what it meant to be asked for that. Not for her power, not for what she could destroy, but for what she could see. "I'll be there," she said. She slept for 2 hours on the narrow cot that had been brought into the underground chamber at some point during the inscription work. She didn't know when, because she had been too focused to notice, and had found it against the wall when she finally stood up from the floor. She slept without dreaming, which was a mercy, and woke sharp and cold with the particular clarity that came from sleep that had been taken out of necessity rather than comfort. The council was already gathering when she arrived. She read the room in the 30 seconds it took her to cross from the door to her seat. Saren, present, positioned 2 seats from Veilor, face composed and operating. Aldrich, standing at the wall behind his usual seat. His hands were still. Not relaxed. Still. The distinction mattered. Marin, the senior advisor, seated, a document in front of her that she was not reading because her attention was on Celine, who had been placed at the foot of the table with 2 guards flanking her chair. The military commander from last night, the court physicians, 3 lords she did not yet fully have the measure of, and a man she had not seen before. Tall, 50-something, with the specific physical composition of someone who had spent decades in military service and had never fully left it behind even after the body no longer demanded it. He sat with the contained ease of someone accustomed to chairs that had been provided for him by his rank, which meant he had been in this room by invitation rather than assignment. He had been introduced, she would learn a moment later, as Commander Aldous Wren. Senior Military Advisor, present at Veilor's request. The moonfire in her arm said nothing about him. She filed that as a positive. Veilor entered and the room assembled itself without ceremony. "Celine Vrath," he said, "has agreed to a full accounting, in exchange for a formal record of cooperation, which will be considered in subsequent proceedings." He looked around the table. "What she tells us will be verified by methods available to this council. Anyone who objects to that verification process may leave now." No one left. Lysera kept her arm relaxed on the table. The moonfire was quiet, receptive, not broadcasting, listening. Celine spoke for 40 minutes. She had been recruited through her youngest son, who had been taken by the Vale 3 years ago. Not as a tithe, not through any official mechanism, but as leverage, a private transaction. Give us the access we need and the boy suffers a little less. Withdraw the access, and the suffering becomes something she would not be able to live with having caused. It was, she said, with the flat effect of someone who had examined this from every angle available and still had not found an exit, a very efficient form of persuasion, because it was not a threat she could fight. It was a fact she had to carry. This is the mechanism that sustains systems of harm across generations. They do not primarily operate through villains. They operate through ordinary people carrying unbearable weight and making the only choices that seem available. Celine Vrath was not a monster. She was a mother who had been presented with an impossible ledger and had been choosing, 3 years at a time, the least terrible entry. Understanding this did not change the damage. It changed what the damage meant. The Vale's plan for the Moon's sovereign, Celine said near the end. Her eyes moved to Lysera, careful, carrying something. It isn't containment. It isn't elimination. She paused. An awakened Moon Sovereign, fully activated and brought into the Vale's territory, is a power source unlike anything they currently hold. The imprisoned bloodlines sustain the dominion, but a voluntary Moon Sovereign, another pause, or one taken at the moment of full activation, when the moonfire is brightest, would be exponentially more valuable than any number of passive sources, Saren said quietly. Yes. Lysera absorbed this with the still working attention of someone receiving tactical information they had needed and had not had. They had not sent her here to be blocked. They had sent her here to be collected, not suppressed, used. There was a warehouse difference between those two strategies, and it reframed everything she had understood about her position in this building. She had not been delivered into a trap. She had been delivered as a harvest. The moonfire in her arm heated to a low, sustained burn. Not rage, colder than rage. The particular temperature of a person who has finished being afraid of a threat and has started being focused on it. The activation window, she said. Celine, how long does the Vale consider the Moon's sovereign to be at peak vulnerability? Celine looked at her. Something passed between them that was not warmth and was not hostility. The recognition of two people who had been used by the same machinery for different purposes and had both survived it in ways that were not clean. 72 hours from first activation, Celine said. After that, the moonfire has stabilized into the host sufficiently that a forced extraction becomes, she hesitated, becomes costly for the Vale. They prefer not to pay that cost. Lysera looked at Valor. He looked at her. She had activated 36 hours ago. 36 hours left in the window, which meant that whatever the Vale intended to do, however they intended to reach into this palace and take what they had been farming for 3 years with the instrument of Davin Holt's manufactured devotion and her family's corruptible grief, they would do it before morning. We need to, she started. The lights went out. Not the lanterns. Those guttered and died in the same instant, which meant it was not a draft. Not the silver fire channels, which she could see through the high window, had also gone dark for the first time in what she suspected was this building's entire existence. Complete darkness. Complete silence. Then, from below, from the passages, a sound she did not have a prior reference for, low, resonant, carrying the particular quality of something that existed at the boundary of audible frequency, felt as much in the bones as heard with the ears, like a door being opened that had not been opened in a very long time, from a direction that should not have had doors. And on her left arm, the moonfire blazed white and stayed there, not guttering, not cycling, burning with the absolute full-throated intensity of something no longer warming up. In the darkness of the council chamber, she was the only source of light. And somewhere below the palace, something older and larger than anyone in the room had ever faced directly began to move toward them. Valor's voice came from directly beside her. He had moved to her position without sound, without light, with the navigation of a man who knew this building's geometry by bone memory. Whatever you're about to do, he said very quietly, you have my full support and no plan and 36 hours to figure out what comes next. The sound from below grew louder, and Lysera Vale, who had been sold for a ledger entry and told she was nothing and suppressed for 27 years by people who understood exactly what she was and needed her not to know it, stood in the burning light of her own inheritance and made the decision that no amount of planning could have prepared her for, and no amount of fear could have stopped. She was done surviving. It was time to fight. The sound from below was not getting louder. It was getting closer, which was different. Not an increase in volume, but an increase in presence. The way a storm doesn't announce its arrival by being loud from far away, but by the air changing around you, by the particular atmospheric shift that tells the body something is coming before the mind has processed the evidence. The palace floor was vibrating, not dramatically, just enough that the documents on the council table trembled at their edges and the water in the glasses moved in small, continuous rings. Lysera's light filled the room. In it, she could see 12 faces doing 12 different versions of the same thing, recalibrating rapidly to a situation that had no established protocol, because there was no protocol for this. For centuries of power built on a bargain with something that most people in this room had understood as abstract, a historical arrangement, a political inheritance, a thing that existed in documents and bloodline records and old cautionary accounts, but not in the actual stone of an actual building on an actual night. Until now. The passages, Valor said. He was already moving, not toward the door, toward the far wall where a section of inscription work that Lysera had not yet examined covered a seam she now recognized as a concealed access point. The western branch runs directly under this chamber. If they've breached the lower access— They haven't breached it, Lysera said. They're opening it from inside. He stopped. She understood this not from reasoning but from the moonfire itself, which had its own form of intelligence, not language, not images, but directional certainty, the way a compass needle is not reasoning toward north but simply pointing there. What was moving beneath them had not come from outside the palace walls. It had been here, waiting, built into the architecture the way a structural flaw is built into a wall, present from the foundation, patient as stone, waiting for the conditions that would let it express itself, the founding bargain. 3 centuries of accrued debt living in the bones of the building itself. Everyone not in this room by necessity, Valor said, in the carrying, stripped-back voice he used when speed mattered more than managing how he sounded, leaves through the eastern stair. Saren, take Cordell and the civilian advisors. Wren. He looked at the military commander who had stood the moment the lights went out and had not sat back down. I need 2 squads at the lower passage entrance, armed full activation if they're wolf-blooded. Hold the entrance. Don't go in. Understood. Wren was already moving. Marin. He looked at his senior advisor, who had gone the particular gray of a person discovering that their intellectual understanding of a threat and their visceral experience of it were separated by a very significant distance. Go. She went. In 30 seconds, the room held 4 people: Vylor, Aldrich, Siren, and Lysera. The guards flanking Celine Vrath had taken Celine with them when they followed the evacuation order, which meant the 4 people remaining were the 4 people who had the clearest picture of what was underneath them and had chosen, without discussion, because it did not require discussion, to stay. The moonfire, Saren said to Lysera, with the brisk directness of a woman who had spent 40 years finding the most useful question in any situation. Can it be used offensively? Can it push back against a veil manifestation? I don't know, Lysera said. What does your instinct say? The moonfire was burning at a steady, sustained intensity that she was beginning to understand as its operational temperature. Not alarmed, not reactive, but fully present and fully engaged, the way a blade is fully present when it's being used for what it was made for. It responds to truth. It burns hottest against suppression and concealment. If the veil manifests physically— She paused. I think it will respond. You think. I've had this ability for 36 hours. Saren accepted this with the rapid, unsentimental pragmatism of a woman who had made consequential decisions with insufficient information for 4 decades. Then we find out. The floor vibration intensified. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. They went down. This was not the plan anyone would have written. The rational strategy, The military-sensible, survival-optimized choice was to hold the ground floor, use the palace's physical architecture as a defensive advantage, and let Ren's squads establish containment at the passage entrance. Come the dawn with numbers and preparation, rather than descend toward an unknown threat in a compromised passage system in the middle of the night with 4 people and 1 uncertain weapon. Valor did not make the rational choice. He made the alpha choice, which is a different thing, and has been confused with recklessness so often by people who have never had to make it that the distinction has been nearly lost. The alpha choice is not the absence of fear. It is not the dominance posture of someone too proud to acknowledge threat. It is the specific cold-eyed decision of a person who understands exactly what is at stake and has calculated, rapidly and without sentiment, that the cost of waiting exceeds the cost of moving. That ceding ground now means having less ground from which to fight later. That the people behind you are safer if the person in front of them is moving toward the threat rather than retreating from it. He went first. Aldrich, who was not young and not a warrior, and was carrying a long-bladed knife that he held with the slightly too correct grip of a man who had been trained with weapons and hoped never to use them, went second. Saren, who carried nothing visible and needed nothing visible, went third. Lysera went last, because she was the light source, and the light source belonged at the rear, where it could illuminate the most space for the people ahead. The western passage was narrow. The inscription work on these walls was older than anything upstairs. Cruder in its execution, the letters formed with the less refined technique of a period when the shielding art was newer but present everywhere. Floor, ceiling, every vertical surface covered in overlapping generations of notation in the dense, compounding palimpsest she had seen in the shielded chamber. This entire passage was a working, a sealed, maintained, centuries-long attempt to keep something contained. It had been unsealed from inside. She could see the damage the way she'd seen it on the 4th wall upstairs, but here it was not surgical. Not the microscopic, careful corruption of Celine Vrath's 6-month project. This was structural. Something that had been working at the passage's containment from the inside with patient, sustained pressure over a very long time, and had finally found the crack that Celine's sabotage had introduced into the system and had put its full weight against it. "It didn't come in," she said. The words landed in the passage's tight acoustic space with absolute clarity. It was already here. The founding bargain embedded something, a fragment maybe, a presence, and it's been alive in these walls since the first king sealed it. Valor ahead of her did not slow. "Yes, you knew. I suspected." A pause. Cordell found references in the 3rd Dynasty records 3 years ago. An account from the court historian of the time. He described a voice in the western walls that the first king had secured through inscription. He described it as a guarantee. A guarantee of what? That the debt would always be collectible. That no future king could fully sever the connection. His voice was level, the flatness of a man who had lived with this knowledge for 3 years and had incorporated it into his operating reality with the grim efficiency of someone who did not have the option of not doing so. It is why the Moonfire dissolution matters. It is the only mechanism that can remove something embedded at the level of the founding inscription without destroying the host structure. The palace. The empire, he said. The Shadow Dynasty's ability to hold power across wolf and human territories is drawn from the founding bargain. Dissolve the connection clumsily, and you don't just break a debt. You destabilize the institutional structure of a civilization. He paused. Which is why the Veil was never worried about a moon sovereign in the abstract. They were worried about one who understood what she was doing. The passage narrowed further. The air changed. She had no better description for it. Not colder, not warmer, not different in any conventional physical sense. Simply changed. The way the air in a room changes when someone has been crying in it recently. A quality that was not chemical but was not imaginary. A residue of something that had been happening here for a very long time. Aldrich had gone very still ahead of her. Not stopped. Still in motion, still following Valor, but with the particular stillness of a person whose body had registered something before their mind caught up. Then she saw it. The passage widened into a chamber she had not known existed, not on any of the architectural accounts she had been shown, which meant it predated the current palace's documentation, which meant it was as old as the founding. Low ceiling, rough walls. The inscription work here was the oldest she had seen anywhere in the building. Faded in places, renewed in others. The overlapping notation of an active maintenance that had been conducted for 300 years by people who understood that what they were containing was not a historical artifact, but a living presence. In the center of the chamber, the floor was cracked, not from seismic activity, not from structural failure. From pressure applied from below, sustained and patient and incrementally more powerful, the crack running in a spoke pattern from a central point, and the stone along each spoke line slightly raised, as if the floor itself was being pushed upward by something that did not have urgency, but had time and had been using it. From the crack, darkness moved, not shadow. Darkness as a substance, a density, a presence, a thing that occupied space the way matter occupied space, but behaved the way nothing material behaved. It rose from the crack in a column perhaps 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, and it moved without wind, without the physical laws that governed the smoke it vaguely resembled, and it was looking at her. She knew it was looking at her because the moon fire in her arm went from steady burn to blaze in the same instant that the darkness oriented toward her, and the orientation was not a metaphor. The column shifted its angle. Its attention was physical. She felt it the way you felt eyes on the back of your neck, the primal animal certainty of being the object of focused predatory regard. That, Valor said quietly, from 2 feet to her left, is what has been living in the walls of my family's home for 300 years. He said it without theater, without the performed grim resignation that the moment seemed to call for. With the flat, exhausted honesty of a man acknowledging something he has known for a long time and is no longer pretending to be comfortable with. There are things a person carries alone that change their shape when spoken aloud. Not because speaking them makes them real. They were always real, and the person carrying them has known they were real at every moment. But because the act of saying the thing out loud to someone else is the first admission that you do not have to carry it alone. Valor had carried this. The knowledge of what lived below his palace, what had been embedded in his family's power, what waited for him with the patient certainty of a creditor who knew the debtor had nowhere to go. For 12 years as king, and before that as the heir who was shown the accounting, for longer still. He said it out loud to her, in the dark, with a column of veiled substance 6 feet away, watching both of them. And something in the moonfire shifted, not hotter, not brighter, deeper, more certain, the way a fire that has been burning in one direction steadies when it finds the source. The column struck without warning, not toward Valor, toward her. She moved because the moonfire moved her. Not a conscious decision, not a thought-through response, but the instinctive full-body reaction of an organism whose most fundamental capacity was suddenly and completely engaged. She went left, hard, her shoulder hitting the passage wall with an impact that sent pain ringing down her arm and jarred her teeth together, and the column passed through the space she had occupied and hit the far wall. And the inscription work there blazed and cracked where the darkness touched it. Valor was already between her and the column when she got her feet back under her. This was not tactical. She registered this with the part of her mind that cataloged things for later examination. His position was not a soldier's defensive position, not the deployment of an asset. It was instinct. He had put himself between her and the thing before any calculation could have reached him. She had no time to do anything with that. The column struck again. He took it in the shoulder, and the impact threw him 3 feet back into the passage wall with a sound she felt in her sternum. He hit stone and his knees buckled, and he caught himself with one hand, barely, and the darkness was pulling back to strike again. "Get up," Aldrich said behind her, not to Valor, to himself, and he was moving forward with the long knife held in both hands in the too correct grip, and his face showing the particular expression of an older man deciding that the gap between what he had trained for and what he was walking toward did not matter. "Aldrich," Saren started. He threw the knife. It passed through the column without effect. The column oriented toward him. "Hey!" Lysera's voice landed in the chamber like a stone in still water. Not loud. Absolute. "Look at me." The column looked at her. The moonfire in her arm blazed white, and she raised it. Not a weapon's raise, not a fighter's posture, but the simple declarative gesture of someone holding a light up in a dark room. "This is what I am. Look at what I am." The darkness recoiled. Not much. Not dramatically. A flinch, barely. The column's density wavering at its edges. The substance of it briefly less coherent, as if the moonfire's direct contact produced a friction it had not anticipated. It recovered in seconds, but it had flinched. That was enough information. She was across the chamber before she fully understood she had decided to move, not toward the darkness, but toward the cracked floor, toward the spoke pattern, toward the central point from which the presence had been rising, because the moonfire's directional intelligence was pulling her there with the certainty of a compass. Finding north, and she was done second-guessing it. She dropped to her knees at the central crack. Lysera, Valor's voice from behind her. He had recovered. She could hear it. The solidity returning, the controlled breath, the focus that did not leave even when the body was compromised. Tell me what you need. Time, she said. 30 seconds. Keep it off me. A pause that was not hesitation. The pause of a man doing a specific rapid calculation. Whether 30 seconds was achievable, whether the cost was one he could pay, whether the asset it protected was worth it. She heard him arrive at his answer in the quality of his silence before he spoke. Done, he said. She pressed both hands to the cracked stone and let the moonfire down. This was the terrifying part, not the darkness, not the violence, but this, the deliberate surrender of control. The moonfire in her arm had been burning under her management since it woke, running at the temperature she could maintain and direct, the way you can carry a fire in a lamp. What she needed now was not a lamp. What she needed was to take the lamp apart and let the fire be a fire. She let go. The blaze that came up through her hands and into the floor was not white. It was every color that white contains. Not a spectrum, but a simultaneity, all frequencies present at once. And it poured into the cracked stone the way water poured into a wound, finding every channel, every fissure, every gap in the inscription work where 3 centuries of containment had worn thin or been deliberately corrupted, and it moved through the chamber's foundations with the particular intention of something that knew exactly what it was looking for. Behind her, she heard the fight. She did not turn around. She had to trust him, not as a calculation, as an act. The same way he had told her what was needed from her at the formal presentation. Just be what you are and trust the process. She was the fire now. He was the time. Neither could be both things simultaneously. She heard the impact that took him down the second time. The sound of it was worse than the first, a harder hit. The stone receiving the weight of a large man thrown against it with enough force that the reverberation reached her through the floor. She heard his breath go out. She heard Aldrich shouting something. She heard Saren's voice cutting through it. She did not turn around. The moonfire reached the chamber's foundation inscription, the oldest layer, the 300-year-old containment work of the first court historian who had understood what had been embedded here and had done the only thing available to him, which was write words around it and hope the words were strong enough. They had been. For 300 years, they had been strong enough, and in the oldest layer, in the founding inscription itself, she found what she was looking for. Not a flaw, not a corruption, a seam. The place where the founding king had made the bargain and sealed it into stone. Not just in the formal documentation upstairs, but here, in this floor, in this chamber. The physical anchor of the agreement itself, written in the language of the original transaction, in terms she could not read with her mind, but that the moonfire recognized the way it recognized all true things. She understood, looking at it, what it would cost to dissolve it here, not her life. The moonfire was not asking for her life. It was asking for the debt she had been carrying since she was born. The suppression, the erasure, the accumulated years of being made small by people who needed her power to sleep. The moonfire could burn through the founding inscription's anchor, but it needed fuel. And the fuel it needed was everything that had been done to her. Every year of silence, every physician's report, every ledger entry. Every morning she had split wood in the frost before the shame could wake up and find her. She was going to have to let it burn. She had not expected to feel grief about this. But she did. A single, sharp wave of it, clean and real and acknowledged. Because the years of being small had been years of survival, and survival was not nothing, even when it was built on a lie. Those years had made her. They had made the hands that were pressed against this floor, and the instincts that had read every room she entered, and the stripped-down dignity that had walked into this palace with a single bag and not flinched once at the contempt of 400 people. She did not want to unbecome the person they had made her. She just needed to stop being only that person. She let it burn. The moonfire went through the floor like a wave. The column behind her screamed, not in any frequency a human throat produced, but in the way that certain materials scream under heat, the structural protest of something coherent becoming incoherent, the darkness losing its organization, its form, its ability to hold the shape of intention. She heard it hit the walls, heard it fracture, heard Aldrich making a sound of pure, involuntary animal relief. Then silence. Then Valor's voice, low and immediate, very close. Lysera. She was on her hands and knees on the floor of the chamber, and she cataloged this with the flat, functional attention of someone doing a damage assessment, exhausted in a way that had no physical analog in her experience. Not muscular, not even energetic, structural. The way a building feels the absence of a load-bearing wall. Not collapsed, but reconfigured. Missing something that had been part of her architecture for so long she had stopped knowing it was there. Still here, she said. He was beside her, his hand on her arm, not the silver one, the other one, the ordinary one. And the contact was not strategic and not managed. It was just a hand, present, specific. "It's gone," he said. "The fragment?" "Gone." He paused. "The crack in the floor is closed." She pushed herself upright and he helped her without making a production of it. Simply a point of leverage, offered and used and then released. She stood and looked at the chamber. The inscription work on the walls was intact. More than intact. The moonfire had found every worn or compromised section and burned through it and left the containment work brighter than it had been in 3 centuries. The crack in the floor was sealed with silver-white residue that was already cooling to a matte finish, permanent as new stone. "I found the anchor," she said. "The original inscription. I couldn't dissolve it. That's going to need more than one session and probably needs to happen with your active participation." She looked at him. He had blood from a cut above his left eye, and he was favoring his right side, and he was looking at her with an expression that had given up managing itself. "But I disrupted the connection. The Vale's access to the palace through the founding inscription is..." She paused, finding the right word. "Interrupted, not severed, interrupted." "How long?" "I don't know. Days. Long enough." Aldrich, standing against the far wall with his retrieved knife and an expression that suggested he was revising certain fundamental assumptions about his own capability for bravery, said, "That was the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen." "You threw a knife at it," Lysera said. "I did," he agreed. "It didn't work." "No," she said, "but you threw it anyway." Something moved in his face. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I did." "Imam?" They came up from the passage into a palace that was very quiet and very lit. Someone had found the mechanism for the silver fire channels and gotten them burning again, and the corridors were alive with that cold, bright light that made everything look both stark and significant. Ren's squads were at the lower entrance. 12 wolf-blooded soldiers who had held their position with the particular quality of people who had been waiting to be useful and had not been given anything to fight, which was its own kind of nerve. They looked at the 4 people emerging from the passage, specifically at Lysera, still blazing faintly silver, still carrying the moonfire's operational heat in her arm, with the rapid, unsentimental assessment of military people integrating new information about what they had just been defending. Ren walked to Valor directly. "The squads in the eastern passage reported movement in the walls 2 minutes after you went down," he said. "Not a report. A conversation between 2 people who trusted each other. Whatever was in there, it moved through the eastern branch as well. Hit the inscription work at 3 points. None of the soldiers were reached." He paused. "Then it stopped. About 20 minutes ago." He looked at Lysera. "About when you, yes?" she said. He looked at her for a moment with the measuring, straightforward regard of a man who categorized people by what they were useful for and was currently updating a significant entry. Then he looked back at Valor and said nothing else, which was its own complete communication. "The court needs to be addressed," Baylor said. At first light. The court has been aware that something happened since the lights went out, Saren said. She had emerged from the passage with her hair slightly displaced and her expression entirely intact, which was such a Saren quality that it almost made Lysera smile. By now, there are 3 versions of events circulating through the Eastern Wing, and at least one of them involves the Moon Sovereign destroying the palace's foundation. Close, Aldrich said. Close enough that I'd recommend a direct address, rather than allowing the narrative to develop unmanaged. Saren looked at Valor. Whatever you're going to say it before they have time to make it worse. He nodded. 2 hours. The presentation hall. Ditkamt. 2 hours was enough time to clean the blood from his face and change his coat, which were the only concessions he made to the court's expectation that its king would appear presentable before it. The cut above his eye was still raw and had declined to be fully concealed, which he accepted without visible concern. Lysera, who had been given an hour by a palace attendant who approached the situation with the adaptive professionalism of someone who had been briefed on almost nothing and was making excellent decisions based on pure inference, emerged in dark gray. Not court formal, not the wool traveling dress, something in between, structured, clean, unornamented. The clothes of a person who was done being assessed by what she wore and was content to let the moonfire speak for itself. The gallery was full. Not the curated attendance of a formal assembly, the full, chaotic population of a court that had spent 3 hours in the dark deciding what to believe. Every lord and lady and court officer who had access to the hall and had used it. 400 people in various states of hurried dress and composure, all of them carrying the particular agitated attention of an audience who had been told something had happened and were waiting to be told what. Valor walked in and the hall went quiet. He stood at the center of the presentation floor. Not the throne, not the elevated dais, but the flat, unmediated center, which was either a calculated democratic gesture or the choice of a man too tired for theater, and she suspected it was both. What happened tonight was not unexpected, he said. No preamble, no ceremony, the voice of a man who was done managing information. This empire was built on an agreement that I have been working for 12 years to dissolve. Last night, the entity holding that agreement made its first direct move against this palace in its 300-year existence. He paused. It failed. The gallery absorbed this. It failed, he continued, because of a woman standing in this hall who has more right to stand in it than anyone else present, and who, as of this morning, I am formally naming Empress of the Shadow Dynasty, subject to ratification by the Imperial Council. The hall erupted, not in the controlled, politically managed response of a court that had prepared for this. In raw, immediate, unmanaged reaction. The sound of hundreds of people receiving something they had not finished processing and discovering that their bodies had opinions before their politics did. It was not a unified sound, it was contradictory. Voices of objection and voices of relief and voices simply expressing the animal noise of shock, all layered simultaneously. The acoustic portraits of an institution encountering change at a speed it could not fully absorb. Lord Fenwick in the left gallery was on his feet. This council has not ratified. The ratification process begins this morning, Valor said, and the hall went quiet again. Any council member who wishes to object may do so through the formal record. I will read every objection. He looked at Fenwick with the level, non-aggressive steadiness of a man who was no longer managing this man's comfort. I will not be moved by any of them. Fenwick sat down. The hall held its collective breath. Valor looked at Lysera. She stepped forward, not to the center, beside him. The shoulder-to-shoulder position of someone standing with a person rather than behind them, which was a statement in its own right, visible to every person in the gallery. She looked up at the assembled court. 400 faces in various configurations of calculation, fear, assessment, and the particular reluctant attention of people watching something historical happen in front of them, whether they wanted it to or not. I was sold as tribute, she said. Her voice carried without effort. Not because she was projecting, but because the hall was absolutely silent, and she had spent 3 years learning to speak in environments where no one was listening and had arrived, apparently, at a precision that did not require volume. I was told I had no pack, no worth, and no future. The people who told me that were not wrong about my circumstances. They were wrong about what my circumstances meant. She paused. I am standing here because what they suppressed turned out to be exactly what was needed. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think the things that get suppressed hardest are usually the things that threaten something. Another pause, quieter. I am not here to replace one set of arrangements with another set of arrangements. I am here because the arrangement this empire has been built on is killing it, and I am the only person in this building who can do something about that. No one in the gallery spoke. So, she said, you can ratify or you can object. Both are your right. She looked across the galleries with the flat, clear gaze of someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Either way, the work is happening. She stopped speaking. The hall was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then from the soldiers at the back, Wren's squads, still in formation, still carrying the operational tension of a long night that had not fully ended, someone started a slow, deliberate rhythm. A sound that was not quite applause and not quite a battle beat, but was both. It spread in the way that genuine responses spread, not from the galleries where political calculation lived, but from the floor where soldiers stood, and from the court attendants at the walls, and from Aldrich Voss, who was not clapping but was standing straighter than she had seen him stand, and from Saren, whose face, for the first time in 40 hours, had released something it had been holding. Lord Fenwick did not stand. Neither did 3 lords whose names she had filed beside their gallery positions and their family affiliations and their 8 months of private meetings with compromised houses. She looked at each of them in turn, measured and remembered. The morning moved with the grinding, necessary momentum of aftermath. Celine Vrath was formally examined before a reconvened council, and her full testimony was entered into the imperial record. Her son, she was told by Valor, with the flat certainty of a man making a commitment in the present tense, would be retrieved. The how was not yet determined. The commitment was not negotiable. The compromised lower passages were sealed with a full reinscription, Lysera and Cordell working through the morning on the new shielding work, building it with the kind of completeness that the original had lacked. This was different from last night's work, methodical, thorough, unglamorous. The Moonfire operating at its baseline temperature rather than its full capacity. She worked until her arm ached, and then worked more because aching was not stopping and the work was not finished. Wren produced the name of the compromised military contact within 6 hours of the council meeting. Not Harvin Colt, as Celine had named him, but someone at Colt's level in an adjacent command, which meant either Celine's information had been slightly wrong, or the Veil had given her slightly wrong information to give them, and either possibility needed to be taken seriously, and both were being investigated. Isara Fenwick requested a private meeting. Lysera gave her 20 minutes in a corridor off the eastern wing, while the rest of the assessment candidates were formally dismissed and given return transport to their families. My father will not support the ratification, Isara said, without preamble, which was the quality that Lysera had identified early as Isara's primary virtue. He considers this a destabilization of the existing power structure, and he is correct, objectively, and it is also true that the existing power structure has been feeding a 3-century-old debt that he doesn't fully understand and would not accept the implications of if he did. She paused. I, however, am not my father. No, Lysera agreed. You're not. I have a working knowledge of 6 of the 12 council families' internal politics. I have documentary access to 3 financial networks that intersect with houses I believe are compromised. And I have nothing to return to because my father sent me here to win something that no longer exists. She looked at Lysera with those sharp, structured eyes that had been cataloging information since she walked into the eastern wing 2 days ago and had not stopped. I am proposing that I am more useful here than I am at home. Lysera looked at her for a moment. You'd be working under Saren, she said. Ideally, yes. Saren has opinions. I have opinions too. We'll manage. Lysera almost smiled again. It was becoming a more frequent almost. I'll speak with her. Isara nodded, already turning to go, and then stopped. For what it's worth. She didn't turn around. When you stepped forward this morning, in the hall. A pause. I've watched a lot of people perform courage. That wasn't a performance. She left before Lysera had to respond to that, which was either courtesy or tactical preference for not waiting on responses. Either way, Lysera appreciated it. She found Veilor in the underground chamber at midday, not working. Sitting at the table with both hands flat on its surface and his eyes on the sealed silver floor crack, with the quality of a man allowing himself, in a private space, to fully feel something he had been managing since the lights went out. She sat across from him. She didn't speak immediately, and neither did he, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had the texture of two people who had been through something together and had arrived at a shared exhaustion that didn't require words to be acknowledged. 14 months, she said finally. He looked at her. You looked for me for 14 months, she said. You built this whole... She gestured vaguely at the documented walls, the table, the room's accumulated weight of preparation. While carrying a deadline on your own life and running an empire on top of it. She paused. I want you to understand that I know what that costs. He was quiet. Not because of the moonfire, she said, because I know what it costs to carry something alone and keep moving anyway. I did it for 3 years on a smaller scale, and it made me the kind of person who splits wood before dawn. She looked at him steadily. You've been doing it since you were 16. Something moved in his face that he did not try to control. The bond dissolution, he said after a moment. I need you to understand. I am not asking you to stay because the ruling bond needs the moonfire. I am asking you to stay because... He stopped, started again with the careful, slightly too precise diction of a man navigating language that was new to him. Because 12 years of carrying this has been survivable. The past 2 days has been something else entirely, and I do not know what to do with the difference. She looked at him, at the cut above his eye and the exhaustion under the control and the 12 years of a countdown written in the set of his jaw. I told Saren I wouldn't walk away, she said. I know. I wasn't saying it to make her feel better. She held his gaze. I was saying it because it was true. The silver on her arm pulsed once, very gently, the way a fire settles when it's found a stable source of air. Not dramatic, not explosive. Just steady, present. He reached across the table, not for her hand, for the genealogical chart, the one she had found on her first night with her name at the bottom in his writing. He slid it across the table to her. The Ratification Council meets in 3 days, he said. Between now and then, there are 11 families whose positions I cannot predict, and 3 whose opposition is organized. The military command structure has a compromised element we haven't fully mapped. The Vale's access to the palace has been interrupted but not severed, and you said yourself the full dissolution requires more work. He paused. The empire I am asking you to help me run is, to be direct, a catastrophic ongoing situation. She looked at the chart, at her name, at the 3 centuries of hidden, suppressed, survived lineage above it. I've been managing a catastrophic ongoing situation my whole life, she said. I'm very good at it. Something shifted in his expression that was not quite a smile but carried its warmth. The first genuine, unguarded thing she had seen from him, free of management and calculation and the weight of what he was carrying. Just a man, briefly, in a room with one person who knew the full accounting and had not left. I know, he said. That's why I needed you specifically. She looked at the chart for one more moment. Then she set it down and straightened her spine and looked at him across the table. Then let's get to work, she said. And somewhere above them, in the great obsidian halls of a palace that had been built on debt and had spent one night beginning to pay it off, the silver fire channels burned steady in the afternoon light, and the empire held its breath, and the 3 days until everything either broke or held felt like exactly long enough, and exactly not enough at all. The Ratification Council was coming. Lord Fenwick's organized opposition was coming. The Vale's next move was coming. And Lysera Vale, who had walked in with nothing and learned what nothing actually weighed, looked at the man across the table and understood, with the moonfire's particular clarity, that whatever came next, they would not be facing it from the same direction they had faced everything that came before. They would be facing it together. And that changed the calculation entirely. The Ratification Council met on the 3rd morning. By then, the Empire already knew something had changed. Not from official announcement, not from the controlled release of information that courts preferred when managing their public face, but in the way that genuine shifts travel through large human systems, through the bodies of the people living inside them. Soldiers who had stood at the passage entrance and felt the darkness move through the walls and then stop. Court attendants who had found silver residue on the lower chamber floor and traced its edges with their fingers without knowing what they were touching. Pack lords in the outer territories who woke on the morning after the lights went out with the particular bone-deep unease of wolves whose ancestral instincts had registered a change in the pressure of the world and did not yet have language for it. Power structures do not collapse overnight, but they shift overnight, the way tectonic plates shift, silent and incremental, and then suddenly, irreversibly expressed in the new position of everything built on top of them. Lord Fenwick arrived with 7 allied lords and a formal written objection carrying 41 signatures. Valor received the document, read it, and set it on the table beside the 12 other formal objections he had received in the preceding 72 hours. "I've read all of them," he said, to the assembled council of 32 people, of whom 8 were Fenwick's allies, 6 were genuinely uncertain, and the remainder had spent 3 days doing their own calculus and arrived with varying degrees of enthusiasm at the same conclusion. Every concern raised is legitimate. The process has been accelerated beyond standard protocol. The candidate has no formal pack affiliation. The bloodline classification is unprecedented in modern imperial record. What? He paused. Every concern is also, in the current context, secondary to the following fact. In 3 days, this empire will either have an empress capable of severing the founding debt, or it will continue operating under a power structure that has been feeding on its own bloodlines for 3 centuries, and will eventually consume what remains. He looked at Fenwick. The choice is not between tradition and disruption. The choice is between managed change and unmanaged collapse. Fenwick's jaw was set in the expression of a man who had not expected to lose this and had not yet accepted that he had. The Council's authority to reject a ratification is formally noted, Valor said. Vote. The vote ran 14-8 in favor, with 6 abstentions, which was not a landslide and was not intended to be one. It was intended to be a legal threshold, which it met, and a political signal, which it sent. The Empire had looked at what was underneath itself and chosen the person who could change it, over the comfort of pretending nothing was there. Lysera, seated at Valor's left, a position she had taken without discussion, and which no one at the table had challenged, because the events of 3 nights ago had established certain things about her position in this building that did not require formal documentation, watched each vote cast and catalogued each face that cast it, and filed the information in the working architecture of a mind that was already, with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who had spent 3 years learning to survive on limited resources, building the map of what came next. Davenholt was brought to the palace on the 5th day. Not in chains, not in the theater of formal arrest. He arrived under an imperial summons with 2 guards as escort and the careful, managed composure of a man who had been calculating his position since the moment news of Lysera's elevation reached him, which meant he had been calculating for 4 days and had arrived at what he evidently believed was a tenable story. She met him in the wide assessment room because she understood the deliberateness of that choice. The room where she had first activated, the room where Valor had first named her as something other than what she had been told she was. She sat at the table where the physician had held her arm and the world had cracked open, and she waited while Davenholt walked through the door and found her there. He had the same face. That was always the first thing, with people from your past, the shock of their sameness, the way the world has changed around them, and they wear the same face regardless. He was handsome in the way she had once found devastating and now simply found familiar. Not threatening, not even painful. Just a face, belonging to a man who had made specific choices and was now standing in the consequences of them. He looked at the silver on her arm, at the way she was sitting, not diminished, not performing ease, not the careful self-effacement she had practiced in his presence for 3 years. Just present, taking up exactly the space she occupied without apology. Something moved through his face that she watched without flinching. It was not guilt. It was the more complicated thing that precedes guilt in people who have rationalized their choices for a long time. The moment the rationalization fails and the unmediated fact of what they did is briefly, unavoidably visible before the machinery reassembles. Lysera, he said. Sit down, Davin. He sat. Old habit. He had never been able to resist her direct instructions, which was one of the ironies she had spent considerable energy not dwelling on. She looked at him across the table. Here's what she had decided in the 3 days between the ratification vote and this meeting. She was not going to perform anything. She was not going to perform composure or perform rage or perform the gracious elevation of a woman who had transcended what was done to her. She was going to be honest, because honesty was what the Moonfire asked of its host, and she had decided, sometime between the floor of the underground chamber and the morning of the ratification, that the Moonfire was not a power she wielded, but a nature she inhabited. "You knew what I was," she said. "Yes." "From the beginning?" "Yes." He said it without deflection, which was the first honest thing she had heard from him in years, and landed in the room with the particular weight of something that had been a long time arriving. "I was approached before the bonding. They had documentation on the Aldon line. They told me what you carried and what it would become if it activated. They told me what to do to prevent it. Dissolve the bond, document the deficiencies, keep me suppressed." "Keep you safe," he said, and she saw in his face that he meant it, which was the most complicated thing of all. "They told me that an activated Moon Sovereign would be, that the veil would take you, that if you woke up, you'd be consumed. They told me keeping you silent was the only way to keep you alive." She sat with that for a moment. It would have been simpler if he was purely a villain. The machinery of betrayal is easiest to metabolize when it runs on contempt, when the person who hurt you did so because they did not value you. This was not that. This was a man who had been given a lie carefully calibrated to make harm feel like protection, and who had chosen to believe it because choosing to believe it allowed him to keep what he wanted and feel righteous about the keeping. That was not innocence. It was a particular kind of moral failure, the failure of a person who accepts convenient truth because examining it costs more than they want to pay. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No. You let me believe I was broken. For 3 years you lived with me and let me—" She stopped. Not because she was losing composure, but because what she was about to say was the most important part, and she wanted to say it exactly right. "You let me believe the most fundamental thing about myself was a deficiency, because it was easier than telling me the truth." He did not look away. To his credit, whatever remained of it, he did not look away. "Yes," he said. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Not for you, for me." She held his gaze steadily. "What you did was not protection. It was management. You managed me the way you manage a resource you want to keep stable, not for my benefit, but because a stable resource is more useful than a volatile one." She paused. "I'm not angry about that anymore. I was. I'm not now. What I am is—" She found the word. "Finished. With the version of myself that needed your definition of me to understand what I was. That version is gone. She burned in the floor of the passage 3 nights ago, and she's not coming back." David sat across from her and looked like a man who had expected to be able to manage this conversation, and was discovering that management required being in a room with someone who was still operating inside a system you could manipulate. She was not inside that system anymore. "The people who recruited you," she said, shifting to operational territory because the personal was done, was filed, was completed. "I need their names, their access points, everything you know about how the Veil recruits through mortal contacts." He told her. It took 2 hours. She listened with the total, methodical attention she gave to everything important, asked clarifying questions in the flat, precise manner of someone compiling data rather than administering punishment, and at the end of it, she stood and looked at him one final time. "You'll be formally charged with conspiracy against the Imperial bloodline," she said. "Valor will ensure the proceedings are legal and the outcome proportionate." She paused at the door. "I won't be attending the hearings." "Lysera, I'm done," she said. Not cruelly, not coldly, the tone of someone stating a completed fact. "Not with you specifically, with the part of my history where you're the central figure. You can be a footnote now." She opened the door. "Goodbye, Davin." She walked out. In the corridor, she stood still for 20 seconds and breathed. Let the last tether of that chapter of her life go slack. Feel its absence. Acknowledge it without drama. Then she straightened her spine and moved forward, because forward was the only direction available, and she had always been better at forward than anything else. The dissolution of the founding inscription took 11 days, not continuous. Spread across 11 mornings, each session lasting 2 to 3 hours, each one reaching a layer deeper into the 300-year-old anchor embedded in the passage chamber floor. Lysera and Veilor worked it together, which was what the moonfire required. Not her power alone, but the active participation of the shadow bloodline host, the ruling bond itself choosing to dissolve rather than being dissolved against its will. The distinction mattered in ways she understood better with each session. Power that is surrendered is different from power that is taken. A chain removed by the person wearing it is not the same as a chain broken by an outside force. The first leaves the person intact. The second leaves scars that influence everything built afterward. Veilor understood this at a level she had not anticipated, not intellectually but bodily, in the way he participated in the dissolution sessions with the full, voluntary engagement of someone who had decided, without reservation, to stop being held by something that had always been, fundamentally, a wound. On the fourth morning, he said during one of the working silences, "My father told me the bond was the source of our strength, that without it we were just wolves, ordinary." "What do you think now?" she asked. He looked at the floor, where the silver residue of the previous 3 sessions had built into a pattern she was beginning to recognize as the moonfire's signature on completed work. "I think the bond gave us power we didn't earn and conditioned 3 centuries of kings to believe that the only strength worth having was borrowed." He paused. "I think ordinary earned strength is the only kind that doesn't eventually demand something you can't afford to give." She pressed her hands to the floor and let the moonfire work. "That," she said, "is going to be an important thing for the Empire to hear from its king." "I know," he said. "I'm working on how to say it." "You just said it." He looked at her. "Write it down approximately like that," she said. "It'll land." Something happened in his expression that was unmistakably a smile. Not managed, not brief. A real one, the kind that changes a face from its trained configuration into something more fundamental. She had been waiting, without consciously acknowledging she was waiting, to see what his face looked like when it was actually at rest. It looked like that. She turned back to the floor before he could see what happened to her own. On the 11th morning, the anchor dissolved. She felt it go. Not as a release, not as an explosion, but as the particular quiet of a held breath finally exhaled. 300 years of accumulated debt burning away in 2 minutes of sustained moonfire. The founding inscription's anchor coming apart layer by layer with the clean efficiency of something whose time had simply ended. The silver residue from the final session cooled to the floor in a circular pattern that was, undeniably and without any intention on her part, beautiful. Veilor sat back against the passage wall when it was done. She sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Is it?" he started. "Gone," she said. "The veil's anchor in this building is gone. The ruling bond is dissolved." She paused. "You're not going to feel different immediately. That's normal. It's like the wolf going silent. The absence of something you've been carrying is its own adjustment." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I feel lighter." She looked at him. "Good." He looked at the ceiling, at the ancient inscription work above them, intact and clean and permanent. "The Empire is going to need a different story about itself," he said. 300 years of power built on debt. The noble houses built their entire identity around proximity to a bargain that's now dissolved. He paused. "That's a significant amount of reconstruction." "Yes," she agreed. "It is. I have no idea how long it will take." "Neither do I." She looked at the silver pattern on the floor. "But we know the starting point. That's more than most rebuilds get." He turned his head and looked at her in the close, direct way he had looked at her since the first assessment room. The look that had never been about measuring or consuming or calculating what she was worth. Just the simple, unmanaged act of looking at a person and seeing them. "I looked for you for 14 months, he said. "And I found someone entirely different from what I was looking for. I was looking for a tool." He paused. "I found—" "Don't finish that sentence yet," she said. He stopped. "You'll say something you mean," she said, "and I'll believe it, and that's— the timing is wrong. We just dissolved a 300-year-old debt. Give it a week before we start making statements about what we found in each other." He looked at her for a moment. "That is," he said, The most pragmatic romantic advice I have ever received. I'm a pragmatic person. You dissolve the veil's anchor in an underground passage at 6 in the morning. Pragmatically. The smile came back. She stopped trying to miss it. The months that followed were not clean. She had not expected them to be, and that expectation served her well. The ratification had been a threshold, not an ending, the moment when a formal structure acknowledged what was already true, which was not the same as the moment when the world adjusted to it. The world adjusted slowly, incompletely, with the resistance of any large system that has been organized around a particular set of assumptions and is being asked to reorganize around different ones. Lord Fenwick never stopped objecting. He moved his objections into the formal record, which was where they belonged, and the formal record processed them with the deliberate pace of a legal system that valued thoroughness over speed, and the empire did not collapse from the friction. 3 noble houses lost their political standing through the investigation that followed Lysera Vale's testimony. 2 of them reconstituted under new leadership within a year. The third appealed to territories outside Velmora's formal jurisdiction and found considerably less sympathy than they had anticipated, because the story of what had been living in the Shadow Dynasty's foundations had traveled, and the pack lords of the outer territories had their own complicated relationships with the dead economy, and were not entirely sorry to see it disrupted. Lysera Vale's son was retrieved from the Vale's hold in the 2nd month, not by Lysera alone, but by a coordinated effort involving 3 moon bloodline contacts that Saren had quietly identified and brought in from the scattered, hidden communities that had survived 3 centuries of suppression by being unreachable. He was 17. He had been held for 3 years, and he was, as Celine had feared, not entirely intact. But he was alive. And alive, Lysera had learned, was the foundation on which everything else could be built. She told him that. On the day she returned him to his mother's hands, in a small room with no ceremony and no court observers, she told him what she had learned in the frost-covered yard of her family's estate, that survival and living were not the same thing, and that survival was not a lesser achievement. It was the thing that made all other achievements possible. He looked at her with 17-year-old eyes that had seen too much, and were still, underneath the damage, looking for a reason to believe the future was different from the past. She gave him one. She gave him herself as evidence. Lysera Fenwick did become part of Saren's intelligence apparatus, and the relationship between them was, as Lysera had predicted, characterized by the productive friction of 2 exceptionally capable people who respected each other's intelligence and found each other's operating styles irritating in ways that turned out to be complementary. Within 6 months, Lysera had identified 2 additional Vale contact points that Celine's testimony had missed. Within a year, she had restructured the Imperial Information Network in ways that 3 previous senior advisors had proposed and failed to implement because she had something they lacked: the political neutrality of someone whose family affiliation had been burned down and who therefore owed nothing to the houses whose cooperation she required. Aldrich Voss retired from the collector role on a Tuesday morning, which Lysera found appropriate, and Vialor gave him a position in the Imperial Archive that suited him far better. The cataloging and preservation of old bloodline documentation, the work of building a complete and accurate record of the lineages the Empire had spent 3 centuries suppressing. He did this with the meticulous, quiet commitment of a man who understood that the real work of changing a system was not the dramatic gesture, but the exhausting, necessary accumulation of truth properly recorded. She visited him there sometimes, in the archive, sat across from him at the same kind of table they had shared for 11 days on the road from her family's estate, in the same companionable silence of 2 people who had learned, somewhere in the frost and the long miles, to simply be present without requiring anything of each other. "You knew," she said once, "from the first moment you saw me, what I was." "I suspected," he said, without looking up from his documentation. Knowing required the assessment. "You rode into a frost-covered yard at dawn for a suspicion. It was a well-evidenced suspicion." He turned a page. "And you were splitting wood alone in the dark. It seemed like the least I could do was show up." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to what she was reading, and the archive was quiet, and outside the windows, the city went about the ordinary, persistent work of being alive. On the 1st anniversary of her arrival at the palace, Lysera went back to the Vale estate, not for ceremony, not for confrontation. She had thought carefully, in the weeks before, about what purpose the trip served, and had arrived at an honest answer. She needed to see it. The yard, the woodpile, the scale of what she had left from, measured against what she was now. Not to be triumphant about the distance, triumph directed at the past is just the past in a different costume, and she was done wearing the past. But because she was the kind of person who needed to stand in a place and feel its dimensions with her own body, and the dimensions of that place were part of her history, and she was not ashamed of her history. Her father was in his main house when she arrived. Her stepmother was not. She had taken a trip to a cousin's estate in the east that had coincided exactly with the announced date of this visit, which Lysera found neither surprising nor worth interpreting. Some distances were the healthiest choice available to everyone. Brennan Vale met her in the yard. He was smaller than she remembered, not physically, the same structure, the same height. Smaller in the way of a person whose certainty in their own size has been substantially revised. He stood in the doorway of the main house and watched her walk across the yard and did not, this time, move to block her path or claim a space in the interaction before she had defined it. She stopped 6 feet away from him. She looked at the woodpile against the far wall, the axe handle worn smooth by years of use. "I came to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I don't know if what you did was calculated or desperate or simply the decision of a man who had run out of other options. I've thought about it." She looked at him steadily. "I can't know. I wasn't in your head. I know what it produced, which is a ledger entry and a wax seal and a woman walking out of her own home with a single bag who had already decided not to look back." She paused. "I looked back for months. I just didn't let myself do it until I was somewhere it was safe." He was quiet. His jaw was working. "What I came to tell you," she said, "is that I'm not going to carry it anymore. What happened here? Not because it was acceptable, because it wasn't, but because I am the Empress of the Shadow Dynasty, and I have 11 separate crises requiring my attention and a founding debt to fully sever and a network of suppressed bloodlines to locate and support. And I am not spending another unit of my energy on the anger that this yard earned." She looked at him with the flat, clear eyes of someone who had measured something exactly and was delivering the measurement. "I'm not forgiving you. I'm releasing myself. There's a difference." He stood in the doorway and he was crying, quietly and without drama, the way older men cried. Not collapse, just the eyes doing what the face would not permit. He did not reach for her and she did not reach for him, because some distances are accurate and should be honored. "The woman you sold," she said, "she's gone. I'm what she became. You don't get to know her, and you don't get to claim what she became." She paused one final time. "But you can know that she lived, that she didn't break, that the thing they tried to keep suppressed woke up and changed an empire." She looked at the woodpile, the axe, the frost-gray stones of the yard. "I thought you should have that, the knowing. Whether you deserve it or not is not my calculation anymore." She turned and walked back out the gate. She did not look back, not because it hurt, because she had already seen it. In the winter of the following year, the first convocation of the Moon Bloodline communities took place in the palace. 37 women, ages ranging from 19 to 81, arriving from hidden territories, from outer pack settlements, from urban anonymity and rural obscurity, from every configuration of hidden life that 3 centuries of suppression had produced. Each of them carrying some version of the same experience, the silence, the told deficiency, the years of surviving inside a diminishment that had been engineered, not natural. Lysera did not address them as an authority. She stood at the front of the room and she told them the truth about herself, not the elevated version, not the account that began with the activation and moved forward through triumph. The full accounting, the woodpile, the ledger entry, the 17 physicians and 3 years of being examined and found lacking, the frost-covered yards and the specific quality of silence before dawn when you split wood to keep ahead of what you felt. She told them that the silence was not what they were. She told them that what they were was what had needed an empire's worth of organized effort to suppress, which was its own kind of testimony to their significance. She told them that the work of being unsuppressed was not a single moment. It was a practice. It was every morning of choosing not to occupy only the diminished space that had been assigned to them. It was exhausting, and it was ongoing, and it was, she said, the most important work she had ever done and would ever do. Then she sat down. And the woman who was 81, who had carried the moonfire silent and buried for 7 decades and wept when she first felt it stir in this building's walls, stood up and spoke. And then the woman who was 19, and then the others, one by one, in the particular way that people speak when they have been silent long enough that the words have accumulated into something that cannot stay contained. The convocation lasted 3 days. The walls, Aldrich noted afterward in his documentation, had needed reinscribing after. The moonfire had run hot enough through the assembled bloodlines to scorch the lower sections. He noted this as an archival observation. In his private notation, he described it differently. He called it the most significant event in 300 years of this building's history. He was not wrong. On a morning in late spring, when the obsidian walls caught the early light and held it in the particular way they held it at that hour, not warming it, not transforming it, just holding it, the way strong things hold what comes to them without needing to change it. Lysera stood at the window above the interior courtyard. The ice-laden tree was long since thawed. It was in full leaf now, the branches that had held their frozen weight through the winter now carrying something lighter and more alive, moving in the small morning wind with the easy generosity of a thing that had been patient and been right to be patient. She heard Veilor behind her before she heard his footsteps. He was not a quiet man when he was not trying to be, and this morning he was not trying to be. He stood beside her at the window. The Outer Territory Council sent another formal petition, he said. I saw it. Fenwick's nephew is leading the reform opposition in the Eastern Assembly. I know. Lysera briefed me. The bloodline convocation applications for the spring session have exceeded our current capacity by 40%, she said. Saren is working on the space allocation. He was quiet for a moment. I am attempting, he said, to have a conversation that is not about the Empire. She looked at him. He was looking at the tree. The week has passed, she said. Several weeks, actually, he said. Several months. I know. I have been... He paused in the way he paused when the language was new. I have been waiting for the correct moment. Determining the correct moment has proven difficult because my criteria for correct keep expanding. She looked at him steadily. There is no correct moment, she said. There is just the moment that exists, and whether you use it. He looked at her then. Not the operational regard, not the king-facing assessment expression she had catalogued in 100 council chambers and presentation halls. The unmanaged one. The same face she had first seen in the assessment room when she set her hand in his and the world cracked open. The face of a man who had found what he was looking for and was still, even now, slightly unable to believe the finding was real. You walked into this palace with a single bag, he said, and you repaired the walls that I had spent 12 years failing to repair. You dissolved a 3-century debt. You built a convocation from scratch. You turned an intelligence network around in 6 months. He paused. And you are the only person in this empire who tells me when my statement would be better written down approximately like that. She almost smiled. Almost. I need you to understand, he said, that none of that is why I am standing here. I know, she said. I am standing here because Veilor... He stopped. I know, she said again. Quieter. The tone of someone who had known for a while and had been waiting, with the particular patience of a person who had learned to wait correctly for him to arrive at the same place. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, the tree moved in the morning wind, and the city below them was already awake, already doing the ordinary, persistent, necessary work of being alive. And the silver fire channels burned steady in the walls. And somewhere in the archive, Aldrich was cataloging a truth. And somewhere in the intelligence offices, Lysera and Saren were arguing about methodology. And somewhere in the recovered territories, women with silent moonfire in their blood were waking up and choosing, one more morning, not to accept the space they had been assigned. She took his hand. Not the way she had taken it in the assessment room. Not the deliberate, information-seeking contact of a person testing a theory. Just a hand in a hand. The simple, unglamorous, completely irreducible act of choosing to be present with a person. He held it. Carefully. The way you hold something that is not fragile, but that you understand the value of. Below them, the city moved. Above them, the obsidian walls held the morning light without transforming it. Between them, nothing was performed. This is what the stories leave out. the aftermath. The long, uncinematic, deeply necessary work of building something from the rubble of what was dismantled. The empire was not healed. It was healing, which was slower and more honest and more difficult than healed, and required every morning to be chosen again rather than simply maintained. The suppressed bloodlines were not restored. They were being found, one at a time, and offered something that was not restoration, because what had been taken could not be given back, only accounted for, and different forward built from the accounting. Lysera had not become a different person. She was the same person who had split wood in the frost, who had learned to move before the shame woke up, who had walked into a palace with a single bag and the stripped-down dignity of someone who had run out of anything to lose and discovered, in the running out, that she had been carrying the most important thing all along. She was that person. She was also the person standing at a window in a palace that the moonfire had scoured clean, holding the hand of a man who had spent 12 years looking for her, watching a city decide what it wanted to become. Both things. At once. This was what survival looked like when it had run long enough to become something more than survival. Not triumph. Not resolution in the clean narrative sense of all threads closed and questions answered, but presence. The deep, earned, irreducible presence of a person who had been told in 100 different ways that she was less than what she was, and who had spent everything she had to prove, not to them, to herself, that the telling was the lie. A throne does not reveal who deserves power. It reveals who remains standing after power demands everything. She had demanded nothing from herself that she was not already. She had only stopped pretending to be less. The morning held, the empire moved, and the last Moon Queen stood at the window with her hand in the hand of the Shadow King and watched the world they had broken and were building, one true thing at a time, and it was enough. It was exactly, precisely, irreversibly enough.